Hello and welcome. You're watching News9 Live. Big day, big event in the national capital of Delhi, national capital of India. Delhi becomes the host for G20, and obviously it is all roads leading to Delhi as of now. A lot happening here as far as the G20 summit is concerned, multilateral, bilaterals, and a lot on the agenda. But first things first, issues that matter the most, not just to India, but to the world. Till now, the matter regarding Russia-Ukraine is stuck. This is what we are knowing from our sources as far as the G20 meeting is concerned. There is no consensus on this issue in the joint declaration as well, and whether the joint declaration would be addressing Russia-Ukraine issue also remains to be seen. Efforts are on, by the way, to bring all the parties on the same table. Yes, Russia-Ukraine issue will be discussed in the joint declaration. That's the word that is coming out. It won't remain a blank. This is the latest that we are learning, that the matter won't be left unaddressed. This is one achievement, I would say, that comes at such a high pedestal like G20. Indian side, meanwhile, has circulated among the G20 members the states of the new text to refer to Ukraine crisis in the draft leaders' declaration in an effort to break the standoff on the issue. What the leaders said in the first session of this G20 summit, and what are the views expressed by several foreign dignitaries. Let's take a quick look at that before we listen to what the Prime Minister Narendra Modi had to say.
आज G20 के प्रेसिडेंट के तौर पर भारत पूरी दुनिया का आह्वान करता है कि हम मिलकर सबसे पहले इस ग्लोबल ट्रस्ट डेफिसिट को एक विश्वास, एक भरोसे में बदलें। यह हम सभी के साथ मिलकर चलने का समय है और इसलिए सबका साथ, सबका विकास, सबका विश्वास, सबका प्रयास का मंत्र हम सभी के लिए एक पथ प्रदर्शक बन सकता है। वैश्विक अर्थव्यवस्था में उथल-पुथल हो, नॉर्थ और साउथ का डिवाइड हो, ईस्ट और वेस्ट की दूरी हो, फूड, फ्यूल और फर्टिलाइजर का मैनेजमेंट हो, टेररिज्म और साइबर सिक्योरिटी हो, हेल्थ, एनर्जी और वाटर सिक्योरिटी हो, वर्तमान के साथ वाली पीढ़ियों के लिए हमें इन चुनौतियों के ठोस समाधान की तरफ बढ़ना ही होगा। सबका साथ की भावना से ही भारत ने प्रस्ताव रखा था कि अफ्रीकन यूनियन को G20 की स्थायी सदस्यता दी जाए। मेरा विश्वास है कि इस प्रस्ताव पर हम सबकी सहमति है। आप सबकी सहमति से आगे की कार्रवाई शुरू करने से पहले मैं अफ्रीकन यूनियन के अध्यक्ष को G20 के स्थायी सदस्य के रूप में अपना स्थान ग्रहण करने के लिए आमंत्रित करता हूं। एक्सेलेंसी,
अमेरिका और भारत में बहुत बड़े पैमाने पर सहयोग कर रहे हैं, जिनमें से क्रिटिकल इमर्जिंग टेक्नोलॉजीज़ है, इंफॉर्मेशन कम्युनिकेशंस टेक्नोलॉजी है। हमने कुछ ऐलान किया जो इंडियन इलेक्ट्रॉनिक व्हीकल ट्रांजिशन के बारे में हमारे DFC की तरफ से $8 बिलियन दे देंगे और इंडियन सरकार भी अपनी तरफ से इतना ही पैसे दे देंगे। हम स्टूडेंट मोबिलिटी के बारे में अलग अलग पार्टनरशिप्स अनाउंस किया जिसके तहत अमेरिका और इंडियन एकेडेमिया एक साथ भी तावन कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि हम समझते हैं कि ये G20 दुनिया के प्रीमियर फोरम ऐसे दुनिया के सबसे बड़े इक्तिसादी मसला हल करने के लिए, और हम इसलिए G20 2026 में खुद मेज़बानी करना चाहते हैं।
There was a joint commitment to contribute to the upcoming COP28 meeting and to deliver on our environmental and financial commitments in order to ensure that we effectively meet the targets that I hope will be set in the communique tomorrow, to treble the deployment of renewables throughout the world and to reach in 2025 the peak of CO2 emission and pursue thus the path towards decarbonization of our economies.
So there we heard it from several players, several voices on G20, and obviously, putting their perspective as far as this global meet is concerned is also very important. But one crucial aspect, Nancy, which remains still a bottleneck, if I may say so, is Russia-Ukraine. And as we have learned from the sources that as far as the language of it is concerned, it won't be left blank. What further details do you have with us?
Well, actually you're right, Pankaj. I always thought that, Russia and Ukraine, the talk behind this is always going to be very important because India's stand on the whole Russia-Ukraine war has always been very neutral. It stand alone. It completely denied that I am not going to be a part of any alliance right now. And, interestingly, to quote Reuters, they have said that there is, struggle over language. They said that G20 Sherpas or country negotiators have been struggling for days to agree on the language because of the differences over the Ukraine war, hoping to get Russia on board to produce what is called the leaders' declaration. And that Russia is being represented by the foreign ministers and with Xi's absence also, there is going to be, a problem that, if they are not going to leave it blank, but what are they going to write up on it is the main, concern over right here.
Right, absolutely, absolutely.
And after I've read about Reuters, I really want you to take a look at what other global media agencies are doing right now.
Very important, I would say, yes.
Because, the global recognition that India is getting right now is commendable, and I want you to take a look at what the Guardian had to say. That Biden renews effort to woo India's Modi in talks before G20. So I was thinking before G20, it was like, India is trying to pitch this, India is trying to pitch that, India is trying to pitch this. But right now we are talking about that Biden is trying to renew its effort to woo Narendra Modi, I think, which is very important. And the way they are, going towards it, the way they are appreciating India, the way they are appreciating India's effort into G20 summit, that how they are trying to be a global leader right now. They are the leader, they are representing global
so
South.
This is what the international media is saying.
Yeah, international media is saying it. This is the report, this is the headline of the Guardian, that Biden renews effort to woo India's Modi in talks before the G20 summit. What do you want to say about it? Do you think that there has been a drastic shift from the way the global media used to cover India and how they are covering them now?
Well, absolutely. I mean, see, there is a marked difference, Nancy, and thank you so much for actually bringing it up, that how a Guardian, a Reuters, a South China Morning Post, for that matter, AP, AFP, New York Times would view India's role. Very critical as of now in this day and age. Obviously, we are talking about Russia-Ukraine conflict, which has divided the world into two. Here we have the host nation India, which is neutral, as you rightly mentioned. Then we have a France, then we have a United States, which are obviously NATO allies, helping Ukraine to fight Russia. So how do we bring them to the same discussion table? And it's a very critical aspect here that for India to issue a Delhi declaration is something which becomes very crucial at this point of time. But still, for the world media to take note of these developments, yet appreciating it in manner which is not very common as far as a BBC is concerned. African Union coming into G20 fold, that is something which has made the world take notice of India. The Guardian saying that Biden renews efforts to woo India's Modi in talks before G20 summit. Now, see, I mean, how tables have turned. I mean, I would say 10, 15 years down the line, Nancy, if I may share, sitting in a newsroom where I would be taking note of George Bush, the body language, what he is saying when he is visiting India, or for that matter, our Prime Minister is visiting the United States. The coverage was all about United States. Now, a Guardian, obviously emanating from the western part of the world, saying that US is trying to woo India. Now, that's one aspect to look at. China, on the other hand, is going all gung-ho over the fact that G20, no matter Xi Jinping is not there, but the way India has also acknowledged the role of China as far as shaping the G20 is concerned, not skipping is a different matter altogether. That is also making quite a wave in China, and especially Neha Khanna, our colleague who interviewed G20 India Sherpa, Amitabh Kant. I mean, the Chinese publications are picking it up like anything and saying that, yes, there is a recognition for China.
Picking up on that, Global Times, one of China's mouthpiece, have retweeted that tweet as well. And, Global Times, because I thought, with Xi's absence, with Putin's absence, West is going to take the lead here. But India is taking the lead,
Right.
They are heading the discussions, they are being the negotiator, and everybody is looking up to India. They are going to negotiate between these international issues that, nobody else could have done it. And I think Rishi Sunak rightly said that this is the best time for India to host the G20 presidency. That we, although it was a joint decision to welcome African Union, but it was a proud moment for, when Narendra Modi announced it with Mr. Prime Minister Modi. He came and he announced and he hugged him. It felt like, India welcomed, India made it possible. So I think it was because we have so many important issues to talk about, and India being the host right now, and India talking about it is such a great platform that we have been given. And as I mentioned, Global Times. So the Global Times have, if you read the headline, it's saying who is the real spoiler. In the G20 summit, they're asking the question. I thought it was going to be a jibe at India, but surprisingly, if you read the article, what they're trying to say is that US is trying to create conflicts between India and China, and India is actually, trying to take a neutral stand. India doesn't want to get into the alliance, but West is forcing him. So even if West and China, they have never gone head to head.
Yes,
they are competing with each other, but still, India still is a good guy for everybody. So, without taking a stand, there is no black and white for India. India is standing in the gray, but India has come up with such a strong global, and powerful image. I think that is commendable right now.
Absolutely. Wall Street Journal, for that matter, also saying Xi's absence at G20 points to growing rift over global leadership. Now, this global leadership, this race also is, clearly evident. But as you're right, staying in the gray at times may or may not be helpful as far as diplomacy goes. But to bring such differing voices on the table and then have them agree to a particular aspect is quite stunning, I would say. New York Times, G20 summit meeting opens under long shadow of Ukraine war. Obviously, New York Times pointing to that. AP saying G20 grants the African Union membership. All those things. Nancy, as the world takes a very close look at what is, the schedule and the deliberations at G20, the bilaterals are also very important. I've been told that Prime Minister Modi has just met his Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida, and there we have the pictures also. Absolutely. Look at the body language. Japan and India, obviously, time-tested friendship, and not much eulogy needed here as far as the dependence, the tacit support is concerned. As far as Japan is concerned, several other gatherings also where we have seen Japan standing side by side with India, and during COVID times also, Nancy.
True. Very
critical. And I believe a short while ago, UK President Rishi Sunak, the man whom everyone wants to see, also met Prime Minister Modi.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's so important that, these bilateral talks are happening, and, the issues that these bilateral talks are covering are so important right now for India, for India's, strategic alliance right now, for India's global position right now. As I've said earlier on the show as well, that, these bilateral talks that, the one that happened with Biden, yesterday. I think these talks are going to be way more historic than the G20 summit. I think they might get, snatch the limelight away, because these bilateral talks, when you talk about, India is no more, asking for help. India is no more, there to, let's please help us here, please help us there. But India is putting a strong stand right now.
Right.
India is cracking deals that are so important in defense, in every sector, in public infrastructure, in technology, in climate. These issues are being talked about in these bilateral talks. And I think, the free trade deal that UK and India is supposed to have, I think I would love to see the follow-up on the bilateral talks if it gets out. If we get the information about, what happened, what are the follow-ups, because I think I was pretty much satisfied with the outcomes of the bilateral talks with Biden, because, they talked about some important issues that, they did a follow-up on all the policy, on all the deals that they decided, they wanted to talk about when PM's state visit to US in June. And I think the important issues that they talked about then, and they did a follow-up right now, I think it's going to be it's going to build a very bright future for our country, and India's international position and strategic ties with the developed countries.
Absolutely, and in that regard, needless to say, Nancy, when it comes to events of such huge importance, where you have all the who's and who of the world, coming together, for a country as big as India, obviously the role that it has to play, it is also based on its own needs also. For example, we need oil, so we agreed to take oil from Russia. But we are, as you mentioned, a very successful trip of Prime Minister Modi back in the month of July of the United States, which is quite surprising. There are other countries who are actually risking their relations with West over cheap oil from Russia. But India managed to, get in that. Secondly, the risk of whether a joint declaration would be formed or not, whether they come to any conclusion or not. How do you see this? I mean, do you believe that it could be a tightrope walk for India just for the sake of a declaration? Because hosting the event is a different thing, but getting what you intend out of it is a totally different thing.
And I think India is doing so much. It's just day one, and in just one day we have so many important things to talk about. We have so many, India is representing itself in the best way possible. And I think if we talk about the joint declaration, I feel like India has always been, India has always taken the neutral stand. India has always, been like, we are an independent sovereignty and we are going to protect that no matter what. But I think at this point, when, Russia, with Xi's absence, with Putin's absence, it's going to be very difficult to form a declaration. Because, the Sherpas are trying to formulate a declaration, but I think Foreign Minister of Russia has already said that no, if there is, if Chinese Foreign Minister have also said that, if there is not going to be a clear condemnation of the war, they are not going to pass it. So at this point, how is India going to tackle it? Because if we don't give a declaration, this will be the first time in the 20 years that it will not give a declaration, and I think that is going to be quite embarrassing for our country. But I don't think so that we'll go on to that. Let's hope that we come up with a declaration, and India presents the best way possible, because India has talked about issues so confidently right now. We have talked about the right issues, not just put out issues in front of global media, but we have also talked about the correct amount of issues. We are providing our best front. We have given our best front foot in the global media, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see how India will manage to write that joint declaration. And I think India has a big responsibility of being a good negotiator right now, and if India does a good job, it's going to be a game changer for our country.
Absolutely, and one key takeaway, I would say, Nancy, when it comes to the day one of G20 is the inclusion of African Union, because African Union, we have the visuals also of African Union President Azali Assoumani walking up to Prime Minister Modi and then taking the seat at the G20 leaders of the permanent members is something which not just tells a lot about India's leadership, but also if we go back, only a few weeks ago, BRICS was also expanded, and BRICS once again, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, with South Africa being the latest member, also, once again, bringing African continent into picture, into the fold is very important. We always talk about European Union, we'll always talk about the interests of the West. We have China on the east, and then we have Russia on the north. But as far as the African continent is concerned, Nancy, I believe that India has done two things. First, it was very pragmatic when it came to the BRICS expansion, and now African Union, obviously giving them the voice, because African Union, although it is based in Ethiopia's capital Addis Ababa, the headquarters, but it deals with the concerns that every small or big country of Africa is facing as of now. It is also very much rampant that how some countries are still very much deeply entrenched in some Central African countries. They are excavating minerals out of that. The countries are poor, but the other countries, the host countries, are becoming richer. All those things. Absolutely. I think a big stand there.
I think the way India approached the whole situation, because India has said this many times, that we are the voice of Global South. And this is not just India being the host, but this is also India being the representatives of the developing countries right now. Giving African Union the platform that they deserve. I think it was high time, and it was a pleasure to see India be the host, while we include African Union as the permanent member of the G20. And I think that it was something so important that needed to be addressed, and India did it. And India is not coming out as just a negotiator right now. India is coming out, as someone who cares about the developing countries, but also cares about, the development that is associated with the developed countries. So India is cracking deals with Russia. India is cracking deals with the US. They are talking about advancement in space and everything. But it is also addressing small issues like food scarcity, climate change, which are going to affect the developing countries as well.
Absolutely.
So I think India, being the negotiator, India being the neutral stand that it has always taken, and I think it's very important for India right now to take that stand, to have the talks with, to include African Union, to give voice to the developing countries, and to work hand in hand and to work shoulder by shoulder with the developed countries.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a commendable job that India has been doing right now.
Yes, also Nancy, since you mentioned about climate, this is one aspect that has been it's climate, energy, terrorism, and obviously inclusion of several of the members, plus Russia, Ukraine there. Talking about the climate scenario, obviously going back to 2015 when Paris Accord was done, obviously United States made a very critical commentary there. He said that it is not up to the developed nations to stop their production, which in a way results into industrial pollution, but it is the developing countries that should take hold on to their horses, not go all full throttle as far as their development is concerned. That was a very precarious situation that it had put, US had put countries like India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and other African developing nations. But now a latest report says that China is the world's biggest polluter. Now, why is it so? Because obviously China's dependence on its coal requirements and coal-fired power units is so huge that we might think that China has a lot of nuclear weapons, but then the use of nuclear energy in peaceful purposes is almost nil. So now for a country as big as China, which is polluting the world, its own air, left, right and center, how do you believe that a gathering like G20 can actually convince countries like China, for that matter West also, to have an equitable view of this climate issue?
I think that is the theme of the G20. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one nation. Because, we don't understand. I think whenever we talk about, climate issues, whenever we, speak about resources, I think there is never going to be a fair discussion between the developed countries and the developing countries, because the developed countries have used the resources, they have taken into account of all the resources, they have done the development out of it, but the developing countries are still scared of the resources because they are not able to use it. You know, we have to use the resources, we have to, you know, cut the trees, we have to do it because we have a development, we are still not there.
The need is there, yes.
The need is there. So I think there's never going to be a fair discussion around climate, because I was reading in the newspaper yesterday and there was this headline that Saudi has said that, you know, we are not going to stop the use of fossil fuels, because that is where our economy, that is where we drive our economy from. And you cannot ask us, just because it's going to pollute the environment, to stop using fossil fuel. What is the alternative right here? So I think with the, you know, with the leaders coming in and sitting in the one table, I think it's important for them not just to say, you know, stop using resources. You know, we have to think about the sustainable development goals. We have to talk about, you know, using the resources in a better way. But instead, we should propose solution that what are the alternatives for the developing country, how the developed countries can help the developing countries to reach that stage, so that we are all equal, so that we are all under, you know, same level. And I think with China as well, you know, the agenda, the intention, we have to, you know, and I think India is doing such a great job at it right now, because, you know, with the West, I would say, with the bilateral talks and everything, you know, they are giving a very clear message to China. And I really want to know what is your opinion on it.
Well,
like,
definitely.
You know, because we are giving a clear warning to China. India has taken a strong stand. India is saying, you know, this Indo-Pacific expansion is going to take place, and, you know, China has to be careful right now, because, you know, you better watch out.
Right, absolutely. And yes, as far as China is concerned, differing views there. And Prime Minister Modi is speaking. Let's listen in.
को रिक्वेस्ट कर रहा हूं कि अगर आप इजाजत दें तो हम आगे का काम करना चाहते हैं, आप सभागृह से बाहर जा सकते हैं.
Right, Prime Minister Modi there. Obviously, the second session underway for one family now, as far as the G20 day one is concerned, and dignitaries still pouring in. French President Macron also landed in Delhi a short while ago. And Aditya Raj Kaul, the man on the ground, Nancy, he is sharing some updates. Let me also bring our viewers up to speed with that. Sources are telling News9 that G20 Sherpas have likely reached a consensus on the wording for the war in Ukraine. Remember, Nancy, we were discussing just that about the concept, what are they going to call it. Draft declaration shared among the members. China wasn't comfortable on wordings around territorial integrity, and that was your question.
Yes, exactly.
That you were saying. China not comfortable on the wordings around territorial integrity. Remember, these are the latest inputs that we are getting in from the G20 summit. G20 New Delhi statement likely on the lines of Bali communique, and G20 New Delhi declaration likely to be forward-looking to build consensus as India would want it, especially very much akin to its role. And final statement of the declaration now up to the top leaders and heads of the states and delegations. This is the latest that we are getting. Obviously, all eyes on the output, the outcome of whether a host of issues, including one particular issue that is war and to break the ice and also bring the differing to be seen. Now, G20 Sherpas have likely reached a consensus on the wording of the summit. Meanwhile, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak would be visiting New Delhi's Akshardham temple on Sunday. Obviously, what a grand view it gives. Look at him, the warmth, the energy with which these two leaders, Rishi almost, Nancy, I saw him almost, he ran towards Prime Minister Modi, hugged him there. And look at him.
I think he's the most excited leader to be in India right now. He's so excited to be here right now. The way he was clapping at the airport as well, while, you know, the people were performing for him, he was so happy to be here. Right. And, you know, to be, you know, reconnected with his roots, I guess.
And there we have it on the screen also. Once again, G20 summit, what the sources are telling News9. Delhi declaration likely to be forward-looking and build consensus. And the declaration now up to the top leaders and heads of states of delegations. Nancy, further to you.
So I feel like, you know, I think, you know, this is what we were talking about. That India, you know, how India is going to, you know, take in account and how are they going to come up with a declaration? And I think India has come up with a declaration. They're going to reach a concession on the wording of the war in Ukraine. The draft declaration have been shared with the members already. And I think I saw it coming that China wasn't going to be comfortable with the territorial integrity, because starting from the way they included Aksai Chin in their map. And I think the way I think PM Modi went in the Ashin and he said there as well, because this is just not acceptable. And I think I saw it coming that China is not going to be happy with India's strong stand right now, that this is we are done with China's aggression, we are done with what they're trying to say, and that the consensus have achieved for the Delhi Declaration at the G20. That is what Aditya is telling us right now, live from the Bharat Mandapam. He has said that the consensus is achieved. So I think it's a great achievement for India, because as a host, I really wanted India to be that negotiator, to do what was what we thought was impossible, because at the last summit, I remember, if that happened in Indonesia, I think they hurriedly went into a consensus.
Right, absolutely. Aditya and Nancy giving us the breaking news here. Consensus has been achieved for Delhi Declaration at G20. This is something which is monumental, I would say, because earlier on it was looking like that there could be some sticking factors, something that could throw the consensus off balance or tilt it in any other favor. But what we are learning as of now, consensus has been achieved for Delhi Declaration at G20, which is something in layman's term, if I may say so, Nancy here. Delhi Declaration has been cleared as of now. This is the latest that we are getting. And the Sherpas who have actually given, and the copies have been shared on the wordings of the war Ukraine. China not comfortable with territorial integrity, and G20. Let's listen also to Prime Minister also, who is speaking just now. Yes, Prime Minister Modi is speaking in the second session. Let's take a look.
भी एक खुशखबरी मिली है। हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है। मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि इस लीडर्स डिक्लेरेशन को भी एडॉप्ट किया जाए। मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं। इस अवसर पर मैं हमारे मंत्रीगण, शेरपा और सभी अधिकारियों का हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं, जिन्होंने अथाक परिश्रम करके इसे सार्थक किया है, और इसलिए वे सभी अभिनंदन के अधिकारी हैं। मैं अब मीडिया से मित्रों को रिक्वेस्ट कर रहा हूं कि अगर आप इजाजत दें तो हम आगे का काम करना चाहते हैं। आप सभागृह से बाहर जा सकते हैं। एक खुशखबरी मिली है। हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है। मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि इस लीडर्स डिक्लेरेशन को भी एडप्ट किया जाए। मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं। इस अवसर पर मैं हमारे मंत्रीगण, शेरपा और सभी अधिकारियों का हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं, जिन्होंने अथाक परिश्रम करके इसे सार्थक किया है और इसलिए वे सभी अभिनंदन के अधिकारी हैं। मैं अब मीडिया से मित्रों को रिक्वेस्ट कर रहा हूं कि अगर आप इजाजत दें तो हम आगे का काम करना चाहते हैं। आप सभागृह से बाहर जा सकते हैं।
I think it's such a good day.
Absolutely.
We have the declaration, Shweta.
And it wasn't expected. It wasn't expected, especially after what happened in Bali in 2022, where a communique wasn't reached, a consensus wasn't reached, and there was divergence viewpoint. There was divergence from European Union, there was divergence from US, UK, the Western countries, the Western Front and its allies, and of course the vested interests of Russia. Remember, G20, Karthikeya, is an economic grouping, but unless there is a final communique, lot cannot happen, lot cannot move. That has happened. Historic day, as some would say.
I think it's a great day. Let us pay that bite of Prime Minister. I can't get enough of it. It's a big day. It's a big achievement, Prime Minister Modi. I think he has done something which the world thought that the Prime Minister will find it very tough to do it. Many people would be chewing their own words. Many people felt that Russia and China would take advantage of this. But I think what Prime Minister Modi has demonstrated is exceptional leadership skill. Let's play out that bite again.
भी एक खुशखबरी मिली है। हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है। मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि इस लीडर्स डिक्लेरेशन को भी एडप्ट किया जाए। मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं। इस अवसर पर मैं हमारे मंत्रीगण, शेरपा और सभी अधिकारियों का हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं, जिन्होंने अथाक परिश्रम करके इसे सार्थक किया है और इसलिए वे सभी अभिनंदन के अधिकारी हैं। मैं अब मीडिया से मित्रों को रिक्वेस्ट कर रहा हूं कि अगर आप इजाजत दें तो हम आगे का काम करना चाहते हैं। आप सभागृह से बाहर जा सकते हैं।
Absolutely amazing. I have no words. Today morning in con call, a lot of people were talking in our when we were having that All India editorial or the conversation on G20, and a lot of people were saying what will happen. The words, I use the word, I have to be honest, honesty should begin with me. And I said it's very tough.
Unlikely.
Tough, unlikely. And Prime Minister has made it happen. What are the implications, geopolitical implications, Shweta? What does it do?
Humongous. What does it tell you? It tells you, even in absence, the participating countries, all G20, including Russia, has agreed to the language. Now, we don't know what the language is because the fine print of that communique is not out. But a joint declaration was accepted during Bali summit. A joint communique never came through, which is what a lot of world leaders were frustrated about. You spend 4,000 crore rupees. In India's case, we spent 4,000 crore rupees to organize this event at such a grand scale. Imagine coming out of this event with no final communique. That hasn't happened. And you were right to say that, you know, perhaps Prime Minister has shut up naysayers,
yes,
and his biggest critics with this. I wasn't expecting it, Karthik, to be very honest, because, you know, this is very tough to achieve. Let's give it to the Prime Minister. You are saying that G20 countries, of whom Russia, US, Ukraine, Russia, US and UK are a part, condemned Russia for war in Ukraine, also agreed to some kind of language around it. How was that consensus?
Amitabh Kant has also tweeted, he says the New Delhi Leaders Declaration has been officially adopted at G20 Leaders Summit. Today's era must be marked as the golden age of human-centric globalization of India G20 presidency under the leadership of Narendra Modi. He has worked tirelessly towards the goal. You know what did Prime Minister say? Prime Minister said, a New Delhi Leaders Declaration has been officially adopted at G20 India Leaders Summit. Today's era must be marked as the golden age of human-centric globalization and India's G20 presidency under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi. And then, you know, it just goes on. But I think so beautiful, you know, Prime Minister, you know, saying this, taking everyone by surprise. Our Prime Minister said, you know, he took everyone by surprise. Prime Minister said, I have received good news. Due to the hard work of our team, consensus has been built on New Delhi G20 Leaders Summit Declaration. My proposal is to adopt the Leadership Declaration. I announce to adopt this declaration. On this occasion, I congratulate my Sherpa ministers who worked hard for it and made it possible.
The New Delhi Declaration, there you have it. After Bali, the New Delhi Declaration, all member countries, the G20 countries agreeing to a common language, common stance and common goal. Remember, the goal here essentially, Kartikeya, is to bring together these countries on an economic platform to have policy interventions and policy initiatives in place which can benefit all these emerging and developed economies, but also help economies that have not developed. Ghana, Nigeria, all African nations. By the way, African bloc is also part of G20 now. It will be G21 is what I'm hoping from next year onward when we pass the baton to Brazil. So that is a big change that Prime Minister announced at the start of the inaugural session of the G20 summit. So began with that. Within a couple of hours, you're looking at a joint statement coming through.
I'm very intrigued because I'm very intrigued that what must have happened. How would have they dealt with the issue of Russia and Taiwan? I don't know.
Yeah, I think we don't know until the formal, you know, declaration comes out in the public record. Perhaps if we have a reporter joining us can also help us understand what that statement is and will help us understand whether the wording around territorial integrity of Ukraine, the war, the ongoing human conflict, whether that was agreed upon by Russia. It's also important to point out that neither the Russian President nor the Chinese Premier are in India to attend the G20 summit. So this happened in their absence, albeit their representation, the country's representation was here. So someone signed the joint declaration. Someone signed it and perhaps it wasn't them, it was their representatives here in India. But to build a consensus on a global issue of this nature, history has been written right here in India, and Prime Minister Modi, and under his leadership, of course, that will be written if there is a historical book that will be written on geopolitics, playing at the world stage. Remember, India has no participation in it at all. India continues to be on the sidelines, has very firmly indicated time and again that we are not participant to your war. This is not our war. So we have continued our imports of oil from Russia, and we've done all of that knowing that there is a global war playing out there, but India does not want to side with anyone's state.
One more thing, if you look at the body language of the Prime Minister, if you look at the visuals of the Prime Minister, he's like pretty chilled out. He was not tense. You made a very good point, and I must agree that that's the kernel of the debate. We didn't spend 4,000 crore for a no declaration.
Absolutely.
We didn't spend doing this Gana Bajana for 6 months. We couldn't have afforded no declaration,
to have no consensus.
Which means that the Prime Minister knew or was working very hard towards a declaration.
Absolutely.
And you know, this summit is very different. It's about Jan Bhagidari. It's about spurning of the economic activity in India. It's about the way culture has been projected, exported, utilized. I think this summit has done a lot of things. I think domestic tourism, domestic economic activity benefited.
Okay, I have to point this out. When we say it's the Prime Minister alone, I think you've got to give some credit to the Finance Minister, to central bank governors. You've got to give credit to working groups, ESGs,
Obviously.
environmentalists. Remember, there have been meetings on meetings. This is the culmination of various meetings that have been taking place from the last 6-8 months that we've been tracking here on News9. Meetings of various working groups, because there are issues that had to be figured out, nitty-gritties had to be worked. There was a B20 just before the G20, during which global business leaders were here in India. So summits on summits resulted in various declarations, various languages being adopted, and final mega summit that is happening right now in New Delhi is a culmination of all those events. So Karthikeya, to give credit just to the Prime Minister would be, I think, slightly much. You have to give it to his cabinet, the cabinet that's standing right behind him. When the visuals of him, accepting it, declaring it to the world that there is a communique out there, those people standing right behind him are to be credited. I
think more than that, my mind is functioning. How did Prime Minister manage Russia? How did Prime Minister manage China? Why didn't China interfere in it? Why did China...
And did not allow Russian, Ukrainian delegation in India. Remember, it's important, Ukrainians wanted to come to India. They wanted their voices to be heard.
But they didn't.
But they did not give an opportunity to
So what is it telling
Ukraine.
us? It tells me that we do not run our diplomacy on the so-called naras. It tells me that we are exercising strategic autonomy.
It's like if you and I have a fight, and imagine if our camera person comes and cools us down, and then he takes the trophy. So it's that has happened. India, which has been sitting on the sidelines,
it tells us that European war is no more the world war.
That it is.
2 wars have been fought in the world. They were all European wars, and it turned into world war because of colonization. I think Prime Minister has defeated that mentality, whereby the world problem becomes India's problem. Russia is fighting America and Ukraine. China is fighting for Taiwan with Japan and other countries. It's India's concern, but it's not India's problem.
It's not India's problem.
And I think
but
Prime
India
Minister
can be a
that.
mediator, which is what Prime Minister has also proved. Even though I'm not a participant, but I can be a mediator. I can build consensus, which is what they've done.
I think a lot of things have happened. I think in this context, even Manmohan Singh supported Prime Minister Narendra Modi. I think G20 in a way has not only got the world together on certain issues, but Indian politics also converged because national interest was there. Let us listen to the bite of Prime Minister once again. It's the historic bite. This bite will go down in history. What the Prime Minister has said. He has achieved the unachievable, which today in morning people were saying is not going to happen. Modi has done it.
भी एक खुशखबरी मिली है हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है। मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि इस लीडर्स डिक्लेरेशन को भी एडॉप्ट किया जाए। मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं। इस अवसर पर मैं हमारे मंत्रीगण, शेरपा और सभी अधिकारियों का हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं, जिन्होंने अथाक परिश्रम करके इसे सार्थक किया है और इसलिए वे सभी अभिनंदन के अधिकारी हैं। मैं अब मीडिया से मित्रों को रिक्वेस्ट कर रहा हूं कि अगर आप इजाजत दें तो हम आगे का काम करना चाहते हैं। आप सभागृह से बाहर जा सकते हैं।
I think you got some important tweets. Can you read them out? You are telling this to me. I should read it out to you.
Let me read them out. It's important because Amitabh Kant, who's the Sherpa, has sent out some interesting tweets mentioning what could be a part of the New Delhi Declaration. What does it focus on? And he says, number one, strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth. So we're talking about economic growth. We're talking about policy initiatives and initiatives for all countries that are participant of G20, accelerating progress on SDGs, so Sustainable Development Goals, and how progress can be accelerated on that front. Green Development Pact for a Sustainable Future, multilateral institutions for the 21st century, reinvigorating multilateralism. So essentially talking about moving away from the Western bloc, not looking at Western bloc
I'll just
anymore.
stop you for a minute. Aditya, are you there?
Yes, yes, Karthikeya.
Yeah, Prime Minister has achieved impossible, boss. You हुआ कैसे यार? How did he do this?
Well, absolutely. This is an impossible development that is really happening for days together. It was being said that a consensus will not be reached at the G20 at the Bharat Mandapam in New Delhi. But within a few hours of the G20 summit beginning in New Delhi, it's now clear with Prime Minister Narendra Modi announcing a good news that a consensus has been reached between the G20 leaders, and the impossible has been achieved, just like you mentioned, Karthikeya. And right behind me is the Himalaya Hall of the Bharat Mandapam at the International Media Center, where in a few minutes from now we will have India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar, Nirmala Sitharaman, the Finance Minister, Harshvardhan Shringla, Amitabh Kant and Ajay Seth actually put in fine print what exactly it happened. Shweta and others were actually referring to the key focus areas of the G20 consensus point, that is the New Delhi declaration that will be finally declared tomorrow. But this is a big achievement. The fine print will be clear in a few minutes from now when the president of the G20, the presidency that the India holds, will be holding a press conference right behind me. The key two players who were behind the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Jaishankar and Nirmala Sitharaman, will be coming here and addressing the media.
But tell me, how did this are we missing a sort of a behind the scene development, Aditya?
And how did a consensus come about, Aditya? As you also pointed out, the problem essentially was the language of the declaration.
She's more excited than me, Aditya.
I am, of course, I'm more excited.
She's not letting me speak and talk to you.
I'm
Shweta is more excited.
I'm very excited. I'm not going to I'm going to hijack this bulletin. But I have to ask, what is the consensus around the language? Is there a mention of Ukraine? Is there a mention of the conflict that is going on? Or have we, departed from that entirely and focused only on economic goals and SDGs and green financing? Is that the only purpose that this New Delhi, declaration which has been adopted is going to look at?
Well, that's right. In fact, diplomacy is not instant noodles. So diplomacy happens over a period of time, and these negotiations have been underway for some time. Behind these 266 events that happen all across the country in 60 cities, we also had negotiations taking place. The last negotiation was the Sherpa track meeting that happened just a couple of days back. And it is these diplomats, these Sherpas and chief coordinators of the G20 countries that are completely, in tune with each other. They're meeting continuously. And you're right, one of the main sticking points was Ukraine. One of the main sticking points was the wording of the language of how the war in Ukraine will be actually described. But it seems that the consensus has been reached. We still do not know whether Ukraine is part of the statement, and if at all Ukraine is part of the statement, how that statement has been drafted. It will be only clear when the New Delhi declaration really comes out and we know in fine print what exactly has happened. But I know for sure that China had problems with territorial integrity being framed in this statement. China had other problems also, and Russia as well had very strongly protested use of some of the terminology and words. So it's amply clear that the declaration is now confirmed, consensus has been achieved, but it's a matter of time now that it will be clear what exactly this New Delhi declaration really is.
Aditya, but what does it mean to the entire world? I was going through Guardian, Reuters, Al Jazeera, and it was like as if the world politics is playing over the G20. What would have Prime Minister done to manage both China and Russia who were not part of it? Or or the fact that there is a declaration, they are not there. It looks as if we can piece all of them together. It's like the world of diplomacy, half of the things are not in front of the eye. Which means that there must have, something
Karthike,
must have been worked out.
What would have really helped is India's closeness with Russia. Absolutely, I understand your question. One of the things that would have helped Karthike really is India's closeness with Russia. India already is close with the United States in Europe, but has historical ties with Russia as well. India also does not want to upset Russia. India at the same time does not want to upset the West. Prime Minister Narendra Modi during the last G20 summit in Bali had mentioned that this is not an era of war. New Delhi will always speak about peaceful resolution, talks and dialogue to take place between these nations and countries so that there's a peaceful resolution. But time and again there was criticism happening from the West and other players as well. But Prime Minister Modi continuously was also in touch not just with the West, but directly speaking to Putin as well as Zelensky. So New Delhi's approach of not siding with one bloc over the other has really helped. Russian President Putin has also welcomed this at several levels whenever there has been a bilateral or dialogue or a phone call between these two leaders. But at this moment, from the G20, from the Bharat Mandapam, the big news really that a consensus has been reached. New Delhi declaration will be out soon, but before that, we'll have key players behind Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Nirmala Sitharaman and S. Jaishankar just speaking in a few minutes from now, right behind me. We will perhaps bring to the viewers what exactly they have to say about the New Delhi declaration. I'm not sure if they will bring out the fine picture of the declaration, but certainly consensus has been reached and we are waiting for the last word from these two ministers.
Aditya, I have to say this. Sorry, I am in studio and not there, but I can't resist saying this. आपने तो पास 2 दिन का बनाया था, काम तो आपका भी खत्म हो गया. चलिए वापस दफ्तर आ जाइए अब.
एक दिन का काम बचा है.
बिल्कुल सही बात है, लेकिन कहानी अभी पूरी नहीं है, पिक्चर अभी बाकी है.
पिक्चर अभी बाकी है.
फ्यूचर बाकी है.
पिक्चर अभी बाकी है. तो आदित्य का काम तो अभी खत्म हो गया. 2 दिन का था. आदित्य दफ्तर ही नहीं आ रहे थे. He was going to Bharat Mandapam.
There can always be a word play, Karthike, there can always be a word play. They could have not, they could have mentioned Ukraine, but termed it in some manner that it would have not upset either the West or Russia and China. So we'll have to wait what kind of a wording, what kind of a terminology they used in the declaration. So that would be important, that would be paramount and key.
So when he's talking about the wordplay, I also want to, before we break into the press conference, as he really said that there's so many things which have happened. What are the economic implications of it? It's not limited to just politics. It has technology, it has culture, it has AI, robotics. It has so many things. Take us through that.
We essentially forget, but G20 is not a geopolitical group. It is an economic group, where politics weighs in heavy as it does in every other grouping. So what were the mandates of G20? What was on the agenda? Agenda essentially was very clear. We wanted multilateral banks. We wanted alternatives to Western financial institutions like IMF, World Bank, which give funding to certain countries at whims. For example, in case of Ukraine did not have to wait for months and months to get that relief package. As in when Russia invaded, there was an immediate relief package sent out to Ukrainians. But Sri Lanka, our immediate neighbor, had to wait for months. Their economy was in tatters, but there was no relief coming from IMF. So multilateral banks, essentially banks that are not dependent on Western allies, that has happened because Amitabh Kant says it's happened.
Aditya, tell me one thing. It's a great leg up for Jaishankar, let us not forget the players, boss. I think Nirmala ji must, had done a great job, but it's a great leg up for Jaishankar. Aditya, imagine what Prime Minister must have said. Subbu, you need to deliver this. Like anyone, the second in command, third in command.
You better do it.
Yes, boss. And he has done it. Jaishankar has delivered this to the Prime Minister also.
Karthike, absolutely, he has delivered, and like how? And Jaishankar is a master diplomat, he's a master career diplomat, and two sides of Jaishankar. This is the same Jaishankar who immediately after the Russia-Ukraine war actually, responded to the rhetoric coming in from Europe. The preachy tone, the kind of terminology and the tones that Europe was using in India, it was Jaishankar who actually spoke in Europe, against Europe, and actually exposed them at their own bluff. So this is the same Jaishankar who is now equally magnificently actually spoken like a diplomat to all the diplomats, counterparts from the G20 nations, and finally which is resulting in this consensus. So yes, all praise for Jaishankar. Yes, Nirmala Sitharaman also had a very predominant and important role, but Jaishankar, Amitabh Kant and Harshvardhan Shringla were the key to the G20 and the process of the G20 that was taking place.
But Aditya, how is Nirmala involved? Just take our viewers. Who else is involved? Mr. Shringla is involved. Amitabh Kant is involved. Which is the team? Let us talk about the team. Take us through the team. The captain we know it's Narendra Modi. But who are the players? Who are the players?
Absolutely, captain is Narendra Modi. I'll ask Manish, my video journalist, to pan and show you. There's already like hundreds of media personnel who are here, international media, national media that is present here from G20 countries and other invitee countries as well. That's the podium where the press conference from the presidency, that is from India, will take place, and the key players will be on the stage. We'll have Jaishankar, the Foreign Minister of India. We'll have Nirmala Sitharaman, the Finance Minister. Apart from that, we'll have the Chief Coordinator of G20, Harshvardhan Shringla. We'll also have the Sherpa, Amitabh Kant, and finally Ajay Seth, who's the Secretary of DEA. So clearly, all the top players who were involved in G20 from the very beginning, from the moment India took over the G20, will be actually arriving here in a few minutes from now. Media was told that at 4 p.m. sharp, the press conference would be beginning. You can see this huge Himalaya hall at the Bharat Mandapam International Media Center. And in a few minutes from now, these players will be addressing the media and giving us fine-tuned picture of what exactly is happening.
So it's going to be Jaishankar, it's going to be Nirmala Sitharaman, and any other person? Any other person apart from them? I think the Foreign Secretary, Amitabh Kant, Shringla, will they be there?
Absolutely, they'll be there. We'll have Harshvardhan Shringla, Amitabh Kant, the Foreign Secretary Vinay Quatra, and as well as Ajay Seth, who's the Secretary DEA.
Ajay Seth. Achha, tell me one thing. You stay with me, Aditya. I'm not letting go of you now.
We are going to give your throat a couple of seconds rest, Aditya. Yes. Karthik.
My question to you is, now once this is in place, G20, what sort of the economic impact of that will be?
Okay, so let's understand what has been discussed. From what we know so far, what Amitabh Kant has tweeted is that there's some clarity on green financing, on sustainable development goals, on multilateral banks. Now comes the hard part, which is the implementation of whatever language has been adopted, which essentially means work has to now begin in putting words to action. And that will happen in the course of next couple of years. It's not an overnight thing. It cannot happen in a day or two. Over the course of next couple of years, whatever credit line has been extended to developing, let's say multilateral banks, will happen in due course of time. But the country will still pass on the baton to Brazil. The baton now goes to Brazil, and Brazil will have to take the conversations forward. Also remember, last time around when Bali communique did not come through, but there were notes that have come out of Bali, the conversations that happened in Bali. It was important for, and people who are closely watching developments as far as sustainable economic development goals is concerned, also people who are watching on what can be adopted by, green financings. So all of that, of course, will be taken into point. So what comes out of it, Karthikeya, essentially will take some time to be implemented, to be put into force. What happens immediately now is that the communique goes out and we'll have some clarity on the nature of regulations that will kick in, perhaps a crypto regulation. I hope, and I'm sure our viewers also know, but I'll apprise them once again, that a crypto regulation was also in the order, with IMF stating that you cannot ban crypto. It's not easy to ban it because transactions will continue to happen. However,
is the forum for crypto, or they have their reservations on crypto right now?
So the forum was told to build regulations, not ban it. India had banned it. Many countries have banned it individually, some have regulated
Regulations,
it.
no ban.
But the consensus was to have regulations, not ban, because you can ban it, but you can't stop it. It's like saying murdering is illegal. You can't do it, but it still happens. It's a crime. So people still deal in cryptocurrency, as you may be aware, on the dark web. It's still used for cross-border transactions, for terror financing also, Kartikeya, which is where it was important to call for regulation. Whether that has come through, whether there's a consensus on that, that of course will also have to be closely
let's play out the
watched.
bite of Prime Minister once more before the press conference by India's Foreign Minister and India's Finance Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman ji starts. Let's play out the bite of Prime Minister in which he says, it has happened. हो गया है.
भी एक खुशखबरी मिली है. हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है. मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि इस लीडर्स डिक्लेरेशन को भी एडॉप्ट किया जाए. मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं.
Sri,
मैं हमारे मंत्रीगण, शेरपा और सभी अधिकारियों का हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं, जिन्होंने अथाक परिश्रम करके इसे सार्थक किया है और इसलिए वे सभी अभिनंदन के अधिकारी हैं. मैं अब मीडिया से मित्रों को रिक्वेस्ट कर रहा हूं कि अगर आप इजाजत दें तो हम आगे का काम करना चाहते हैं. आप सभागृह से बाहर जा सकते हैं.
Sorry, Sri, I got you up. I know Sri, our editor, is in East Coast. It's very early in Washington, and I've got Sri up there. Sri Shweta is with me from our business bureau, and we had to call Sri and say, Sri, boss, can you come?
This is
and
historic.
within 5 minutes, I tested him. Last time I spoke to him, he said, I get up at 6. I get up very early. So I said, let's test it today, boss. It's an historic day. Prime Minister has said something so historic, and he said, okay, I'm coming in. So Sri, what a wonderful day. What a wonderful day. Prime Minister has done.
Absolutely.
Unbelievable.
So, Kartikeya, I'm very happy to say that anyone who has been watching News9 and our coverage of G20 would have got the inside scoop a little early, because yesterday we had stuck our neck out as a publication and said that Modi hai to mumkin hai. And I think our Prime Minister has delivered the goods. Any skeptics about, who are doubtful of India's ability to navigate these treacherous international geopolitics, I think all those concerns have now been laid to rest. I think India has demonstrated without any doubt its ability to fulfill the expectation the world has of a significant role for India going ahead in the 21st century, Kartikeya. So I think this is a big win, not just for the Prime Minister personally, but also for India as a nation, as an emerging nation, as an emerging global power. And most importantly, Kartikeya, this is a very clear indication of the room I think Western powers and many other parts of the world, the global South, is willing to give India to achieve what they believe is a larger goal in the larger interest of the world. So this is a very solid endorsement of India's leadership, to my mind, Kartikeya, and definitely a personal win for Prime Minister Modi, because let us not forget that he has conducted the G20 in a very, very different fashion. It has actually
Sri,
set
can
a
I
new
ask you a
benchmark.
technical question, before we get into a broad thing, Shweta, I have got this message from my input editor, Brajesh. He has asked me, please ask this from Sri. Okay, so I do that.
Okay.
He's getting excited in the studio. He says, next G's allies, the Bharat 6G Alliance today announced that they have signed a memorandum of understanding to explore collaboration opportunities on 6G wireless technologies. The work will encompass aligning research development priorities that support a common 6G vision. A lot of stories have started to come on this right
Absolutely.
now. What does it mean, Sri?
Can I also quickly add to that? A precursor to G20, Shri, and since you track economy policy very, very closely, we've seen greater ties between the two countries as far as transfer of technology is concerned. And now that's playing up even after an official communication has been reached. What sort of alliance are we looking at, and what sort of partnership are we looking at as far as tech transfer is concerned between US and India? It appears that the partnership is stronger than ever.
Absolutely, because, when Prime Minister Modi came here in June, it was clear that the US was going to back India with critical technology. Now, that's critical technology going to be in the area of IT, communications, and defense as well. So I think this is, again, basically US saying that India is now a new partner. We are going to equip India with new technology, with more state-of-the-art technology, which in some sense allows the US also to counterbalance China. Because let us not forget that China had the 5G technology. Huawei is a global player in 5G technology, and a lot of companies are now moving away from Huawei because of the concerns they have on so this technology capability which US is now willing to give India is definitely not just important from an infrastructure perspective, but also it's a symbolic of the trust of the new, the friendship that's evolving between the two nations, Kartikeya.
Right. Okay, Nishwata, may I ask this question? Sri, very soon Nirmala Sitharaman and Jaishankar will hold a press conference. What is your take, how are they able to deal with the issues like Taiwan and Ukraine war? How did they manage, what must have happened?
Well, I don't have an inside track, unfortunately, but I can guess how India would have navigated this issue. See, I think yesterday also when we were chatting, it was clear that since the Bali declaration had already called the Russian, invasion of Ukraine a war, and there were significant statements made on that, I think they would have used that as a benchmark and convinced Russia that, what we're going to say, what we're going to talk about is not going to be anything worse than what has already been said in the Bali declaration. So that is possibly one tack which the Indian government and the Indian diplomats would have used to my best guess. And on I believe that China has objected on certain territorial use of the word territorial boundaries, and so I think again they would have probably fallen back on the UN UN enabled consensus and agreements which have been enabled over the last several years in some of these contentious border disputes and maritime disputes that China has, to convince the key stakeholders that what we are now stating in the declaration is nothing extraordinary, it is nothing provocative. In fact, it becomes a provocation only when China repeatedly objects and denies, and refuses to acknowledge what has been agreed upon at international multilateral fora, and China's refusal to work within this international framework, Kartikeya. So I think a lot of obviously convincing has gone into this, but my understanding is what India has been able to prove is two things. One is that this is nothing, there is nothing mischievous or nothing extraordinarily controversial about what we are stating in the declaration. And number two, it has also been able to, apart from these issues, also been able to prove or convince the world leaders that this declaration or these wordings or these commitments are important to move these conversations forward in a meaningful way. So I think at two levels, India has probably worked and achieved this. So kudos to Indian bureaucrats and the team that was working on it.
All right. And while we are celebrating this big achievement, I have to make our viewers understand why is it big in the first place. India had a very difficult road to travel, Shri, and if you'll agree with me, a very precarious position. You cannot offend your Western allies by not mentioning Ukraine at all. You cannot offend Russia by saying it's an all-out war. And India's managed to traverse a path which is a balanced path, which in a sense does not, nobody has an objection to, makes everybody happy. You know, the likelihood of that was unfathomable even about 12 hours ago. I mean, 6 hours ago, I remember Kartikeya and I talking in the newsroom, and Kartikeya was like, doesn't look like it's going to come through, doesn't look like it's going to happen. You know, after Bali, we saw a lot of wrath. European Union was angry at Indonesia for not calling it an all-out war. Russia never agreed to calling it just a dispute. So it's, you know, to reach a consensus on an issue like that, that takes some amount of gumption, Shri.
No, absolutely, Neha, because see, it was not just a difficult road, but I would also say that if there was any one country which could have pulled it off, brought all these disparate forces and disparate interests together, is someone like India. Because I think over the last, several years, I think India's foreign policy has actually matured tremendously. And, it's very evident on the global stage that India is not interested in, being part of any bloc as such, that we have an independent foreign policy that, seeks to balance everyone's interest and work for the larger interest of the world. So, our move to bring, African Union into G20, I think it's a very, very important move. I think people are not understanding how significant this move is. Because you cannot have a mass of 20% of world population, 18% or roughly 20%, kept out of these important conversations when we are actually talking about multilateral framework, about funding, about food security. These are issues that directly impact these countries the most. Because, for developed countries, for rich countries, it is never about access to food per se. It's about food inflation. That something that's available becomes slightly more expensive. But for these people, for these countries, the people of these countries, it's literally a question of life and death. So I think what India has done is tremendous. And I truly believe that if anyone could have done this in this kind of an environment where we see a clear polarization happening between US and Europe on one side and China, Russia on the other side, our ability to bring a larger part of the world into G20 and say that they are equal stakeholders, we must have them, we must listen to them, their concerns, and address those issues. I think it's a very, very significant thing that India has done, Neha.
Okay, let me play out that bite of Prime Minister once again to all the viewers who are joining us. Let's listen to the Prime Minister, the way he broke the news, the way he said, "Ek achhi khabar mujhe aapko deni hai," and then people and he took a pause and then he said, "Consensus ban gaya hai." Let's play that out.
भी एक खुशखबरी मिली है हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है। मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि इस लीडर्स डिक्लेरेशन को भी एडॉप्ट किया जाए। मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं। इस अवसर पर मैं हमारे मंत्रीगण, शेरपा और सभी अधिकारियों का हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं, जिन्होंने अथाक परिश्रम करके इसे सार्थक किया है और इसलिए वे सभी अभिनंदन के अधिकारी हैं। मैं अब मीडिया से मित्रों को रिक्वेस्ट कर रहा हूं कि अगर आप इजाजत दें तो हम आगे का काम करना चाहते हैं, आप सभागृह से बाहर जा सकते हैं।
आगे का काम बचा है।
आगे का काम बचा, बट देयर आर टू थिंग्स इन माय माइंड। एक तो समिट तो आज ही खत्म हो गई, वी हैड डन प्रिपरेशंस टिल टुमारो,
सो भूल जाते हैं थर्ड सेशन इज टुमारो मॉर्निंग।
I don't know what will happen in the session. It's like the big takeaway has come. That's one. Secondly, there's a gala dinner at the president's house. I think it's going to be very, very different. I think the Prime Minister would be completely in a different mood because yesterday there was a challenge at hand. Today he has delivered it. In terms of people's perception, Prime Minister has delivered the most important part. बाकी क्या है ना journalistic terms श्री, ceremony बची है ना, काम कर दिया. He has done it.
Kartikeya, like you said, we have gone from crisis to celebration in a matter of hours. And that's remarkable. That's truly remarkable.
That's remarkable.
But काम पूरा नहीं हुआ है, and which is where I think Shri will come in. Shri, number of bilateral conversations are still pending. Prime Minister received Joe Biden at his home yesterday. Exception was made. A bilateral conversation happened there between the US President, Indian Prime Minister. It happened today with Rishi Sunak, Japanese Prime Minister. A series of bilateral conversations are expected to take place on the sidelines. So even as the multilateral forum is on and multilateral developments are happening, there are conversations happening on the sidelines which could be of great benefit to India, come to think of it.
That's right, Neha. But, let us remember that I think more than bilateral, I think it's the multilateral objectives which probably are important in a G20 summit. While we cannot, underemphasize how important these bilateral conversations are for India, but I think the objective and the Prime Minister's own objective would have been to shepherd the commitment that India has made to
the
countries at
PC
large.
has started. I'm sorry, I'm cutting you short. Stay with me. Jai Shankar, India's Foreign Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman, Finance Minister, Amitabh Kant, they're all there. And yes, 15 bilaterals, Prime Minister, 15 bilaterals for India, and very important developments also. Mamta might get to meet Sheikh Hasina, and National Security Advisor of United States of America had a bilateral with his Russian counterpart. So a lot of important developments are taking place. So this is like, oh my God, the entire thing.
A very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for coming at short notice to this press conference on behalf of the G20 presidency. To give us a sense of the recent developments that have taken place, we have the pleasure of having with us Honorable External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, Honorable Finance Minister Madam Nirmala Sitharaman, Sherpa, Amitabh Kant sir, Secretary DA, also Foreign Secretary sir, as well as Shri Shingla, Chief Coordinator of the G20. They will make brief opening statements, after which we'll open the floor for questions. Please note that we may not be able to accommodate all your questions given the time limit, but I would request now, sir, if you would like to take the floor first.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Friends from the media, it is a great pleasure for all of us to speak to you even as the G20 summit deliberations continue. You may be aware that at the start of the second session, the summit has adopted the G20 New Delhi Leaders Declaration. What I would like to do is to give you an overarching perspective of India's G20 presidency. Thereafter, I would request my colleague, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, to speak about the key outcomes from the finance track. The Indian G20 Sherpa, Amitabh Kant, will then similarly speak on the results of the Sherpa track. We would thereafter be very glad to respond to your questions and comments. The message of our presidency, as you are all aware, is that we are one earth, one family, and we share one future. This draws the entire proceedings of the New Delhi summit are in fact organized accordingly, with 3 sessions devoted to each aspect of this theme. Now, reflecting this approach, we have consciously sought to make this G20 as inclusive and broad-based as possible. It is witnessing the participation of its 20 member states, 9 invitee nations, and 14 international organizations. It is a matter of particular satisfaction for us that the African Union has this morning become a permanent member of the G20, that too during the Indian presidency. This is in keeping with the priority that we attach to addressing the urgent concerns of the global South. You would recall that at the beginning of our presidency, at Prime Minister Modi's initiative, 125 nations were consulted to express the voice of the global South. In terms of its organization and program, the Indian presidency, if I may say so, has been exceptional. Events have been spread across 60 cities, which are truly across the length and breadth of India. There has been a popular participation and a societal involvement of an extraordinary degree. The interest in G20 proceedings have been particularly strong among our youth. It has been an opportunity to making India world ready and the world India ready. The declaration that the leaders have agreed on today focuses on promoting strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth. It seeks to accelerate progress on SDGs and has come up with an action plan accordingly. It envisages a Green Development Pact for a sustainable future. It endorses high-level principles on lifestyle for sustainable development, voluntary principles on hydrogen, the Chennai principles for a sustainable and resilient blue economy, and the Deccan principles on food security and nutrition, among others. The transformative and inclusive role of technology has been highlighted with a focus on digital public infrastructure. The Indian presidency's proposal of a One Future Alliance has also been noted. The G20 has reaffirmed the fundamental importance of gender equality and committed to halve the digital gender gap by 2030. Recognizing that the post-pandemic world order must necessarily be different from the world before it, the leaders have also emphasized the need to reinvigorate multilateralism and reform international financial institutions. This is particularly relevant to managing global debt vulnerabilities. So, as you can see, there have been many far-reaching and very consequential policies and decisions that have been agreed upon today. Keeping all that in mind, I would, at this stage, request Finance Minister to highlight the key issues from the finance track.
Thank you, Jaishankarji. As was said by the External Affairs Minister, under the guidance of Honorable Prime Minister, India's G20 presidency has worked for the theme One Earth, One Family, One Future. So today we are in a position to adopt, through the finance track, people-centric, action-oriented and far-sighted approach, and as a result of which several outcomes of the finance track will certainly reflect these objectives with which we started the negotiations. It has been very clear in our mind that we should ensure that no one is left behind in our pursuit of global solutions. So we have endeavored to support countries, especially those from the global south, to be an integral part of the global decision-making process. The G20, as you all know, is a very diverse group. Each country is at different milestones of economic development, and their trajectory is also very different in achieving their developmental goals. So through well-curated debates, and careful assimilation of all the perspectives, the Indian presidency has crafted solutions that resonate with each member, offering a shared path forward for all. Many action-oriented outcomes of this presidency contain comprehensive strategies that cater to the unique needs and aspirations of all developing nations. We assumed the presidency at a challenging time of geopolitical tension. The Indian presidency has worked to ensure that these divergences don't overshadow the core developmental outcomes or concerns of the global community that demand collaborative solutions. So today, as I look back at the 10 months of Indian presidency, I am left with gratitude and satisfaction. I can confidently state that the Indian G20 presidency has walked the talk. Now, let me share with you just some of the key achievements of the Indian presidency, the finance track. First one is the outcomes which are focused on strengthening the MDBs to address shared global challenges of the 21st century. So under this strengthening MDBs, there are 4 key highlights that I'd like to bring to your notice. The first one is agreement on the need for a better, bigger, and more effective MDBs. It is so necessary to have better, bigger, and more effective MDBs because the developmental demands from all across the globe is so high, these institutions will have to be better and bigger. This is also going to contribute to enhancing representation and voice of developing countries in the decision making. The second under the MDBs, strengthening of MDBs, is the G20 Independent Expert Group on strengthening MDBs, and this was established and it has submitted its volume 1. The first report, their report consists of 2 volumes. The first volume has already been submitted. The report recommends a triple agenda that dovetails with the call for the bigger, better, and more effective MDBs. The third point in strengthening MDBs is the agreement to collectively work towards boosting World Bank's financing capacity. Here the options will be explored that will deliver a powerful boost to the IBRD headroom to support low-income and middle-income countries. And the fourth, endorsement for the G20 roadmap for implementation of the recommendations of an independent panel on capital adequacy framework of the MDBs. So the CAF recommendations are focused on enabling MDBs to use their existing resources effectively. The roadmap estimates, this is going to be of interest for the media, the roadmap estimates that implementation of the CAF and the measures thereby will potentially yield additional lending headroom of approximately $200 billion over the next decade. So through these achievements, India has harnessed the opportunity provided by the G20 presidency to effectively articulate and embed the priorities of the global south in the larger global conversation on the MDB reforms. I move to the second, laying the building blocks for a globally coordinated and comprehensive policy and regulatory framework for crypto assets. The global push for clearer policies on crypto assets has gained momentum under the Indian presidency, and a global consensus is emerging on the same. The presidency will support the IMF and the FSB, and FSB is also setting the contours of the regulatory framework for a globally coordinated approach to crypto assets. So the presidency, with the support of IMF and the FSB, is setting these contours. The IMF and FSB synthesis paper, about which I've spoken to the media earlier, including a roadmap. On that, I just want to give my observation This synthesis paper delves into how the policy and regulatory frameworks developed by the IMF and the FSB, alongside the other standard-setting bodies, will fit together and interact with each other. This paper is now available in the public domain for all of you all to see. The third one, which I'd like to draw your attention to, is the financial inclusion and productivity gains through digital public infrastructure. India, as you all are aware, through the India Stack, became the first country to develop all three foundational DPIs: the digital identity, the real-time fast payment, and a platform to safely share personal data without compromising privacy. So embedded this concept in the G20 financial inclusion agenda by formulating G20 policy recommendations for advancing financial inclusion and productivity gains through digital public infrastructure. This set of recommendations cover 5 aspects: use of DPIs and accelerating financial inclusion, fostering well-designed DPIs, regulatory and supervisory aspects of DPI, institutional and governance arrangements by DPI, and ensuring customer protection. So DPI has also been integrated into the G20 Financial Inclusion Action Plan, the FIAP, which will run between 2024 and 2026. That's a strong legacy of the Indian presidency. We also assume the co-chair of the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion. The implementation of the Financial Inclusion Action Plan, as well as the policy recommendations on DPI, will remain as areas that will continue to be heard across the G20 forum. So the fourth one, which I'd like to highlight, is the debt resolution under the common framework and also beyond the common framework. Since its establishment in 2021, only Chad as a country has had its debt restructured. The others have been waiting. So since India took over the G20 presidency, good progress has been made in the ongoing country cases under the common framework of debt treatment, and the 3 countries in that are Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia. We've also succeeded in using the G20 platform to also put in place a coordinated mechanism to address the debt situation of Sri Lanka, which is outside of the common framework. So G20 will continue discussing the policy-related issues linked to the implementation of the common framework and make periodically such appropriate recommendations. The launch of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which is co-chaired by IMF, the World Bank, and also the G20 presidency, to enhance the conversation among the various stakeholders and address current shortcomings in the debt restructuring process. That has now become an institution which is actually acting as a catalytic agent in getting resolutions done faster. The fifth point under the finance track, which I'd like to bring to your notice, is the financing of cities of tomorrow. Key concerns of the low-income countries and emerging markets is always been to mobilize resources for financing sustainable, resilient, and also inclusive cities of tomorrow. The G20 principles, which are issued for financing cities of tomorrow to promote effective and efficient use of financial resources, to support urban development that is socially inclusive, environmentally responsible, and economically sustainable, are now all under the framework of the principles which have been used. The MDBs and the development financial institutions can use these principles in their financing plans for urban infrastructure. The sixth, which I'd like to quickly draw your attention, is the 2-pillar solution on global taxation, the international taxation. We've made substantial progress in the two-pillar solution, and the work has also happened on the exchange of information on immovable property transactions between countries. There is a launch of the pilot program of the South Asia Academy in India for tax and financial crime investigation in collaboration with the OECD. The seventh, on which I'll elaborate, is mechanism to support the timely and adequate mobilization of resources for climate finance. Till date, the conversation was focused on calling on developed countries to say, where is that $100 billion US dollars, which didn't come. But Indian presidency adopted an action-oriented approach, and the G20 explored mechanisms that can support timely and adequate mobilization of resources for climate finance, facilitating access to multilateral climate funds and enhancing their leverage and ability to mobilize private capital has also been our focus. Special focus again on development, demonstration, deployment of green and low carbon technologies. Now the list of outcomes, I've pointed out 7, just 3 more which I'll not go into the detail, but you can take it as enough has been done on that. I'll also put it out for your consideration. Scaling up sustainable finance for social sectors, health and education. Technical assistance for capacity building. Then global conversation on transition policies, especially to include range of options, both on pricing and non-pricing. And the third one, enhancing finance health collaboration so as to cover many other work streams as well. So I listed out 7, elaborated on them, 3 others which have not elaborated, but on all of them, substantial progress and outcomes have been achieved. India's received tremendous support from the G20 members across the table. The outcomes of the Indian presidency are a testimony to India's commitment to multilateralism and for international cooperation. We assure the upcoming Brazilian presidency of our strong support and to continue the momentum on key issues of global importance. I now hand over back to Minister Jaishankar.
Thank you, Nirmala ji. May I now request G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant to bring out the major outcomes from the Sherpa track.
Thank you, Minister. So first of all, when we started India's presidency, the Prime Minister had said that India's presidency must be inclusive, it must be decisive, it must be ambitious, and it must be action-oriented. The New Delhi Leaders' Declaration has 83 paras in all. All 83 paras have 100% consensus across all countries. There are 8 paras on the geopolitical issue which is entitled Planet, People, Peace and Prosperity. All those 8 paras have 100% acceptance. All countries have unanimously supported the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. This is one declaration without a single footnote and without any chair's summary. This is a complete statement with 100% unanimity. This demonstrates both the Prime Minister's and India's great ability to bring all developing countries, all emerging markets, all developed countries, China, Russia, everybody together on the same table and bring consensus. Secondly, this has been the most ambitious presidency in G20's history ever, because the number of outcomes it has, both the outcomes and the annexed documents are about 112, which is more than 2.5 times which has ever been achieved before. Thirdly, this presidency, if you go through the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration, it has a huge India narrative, it has a huge India footprint, whether you look at the Deccan high-level principles on food security, whether you look at the Chennai high-level principles for blue ocean economy, whether you look at the Goa roadmap for tourism, whether you look at the Gandhinagar implementation roadmap for land restoration or Jaipur call for enhanced MSMEs, all this will leave a huge footprint of India in G20. So one of the key achievements to my mind, one is that we've achieved a very major green development pact in today's world of climate action and climate finance. Every single country has come together to focus on green development pact, which has financing, which has focused on global greenhouse gas emission by 43% by 2030, which has a doubling provision of adaptive finance by 2025, which has a global biofuel alliance, which has completely new principles of life for sustainable development, which has ending plastic pollution, which has reducing disaster risk, and a whole lot of other components put together as the Green Development Pact of the leaders of G20 countries for a greener world of tomorrow. Secondly, there is a huge focus on accelerating progress on sustainable development goals because the COVID had hit a vast segment of our population. There's a G20 action plan to accelerate progress on SDGs. There is a huge focus on education, health, nutrition. There's a huge focus on creative industries like culture as a transformation for SDGs. And there is a huge focus on inclusive and resilient growth in this entire things, some of which, most of which the finance minister has spoken about, so I'm not talking. But I think one of the biggest achievements of this New Delhi Leaders Declaration is what we've achieved on women-led development with a massive focus on women empowerment and gender equality. And this focuses on reducing labor force participation gap, bridging the gender digital divide. There's a huge focus on gender inclusive climate action. There's a completely big focus on women's food security, nutrition and well-being. And we've created a new working group on empowerment of women, which Brazil will carry forward. There's the next key big focus has been on technological transformation and the digital public infrastructure. Before we started our presidency, there was a vacuum on the digital world. There was no definition of digital public infrastructure. There was no framework. Both the definition and the framework has been accepted by G20. And for the first time, there is a new financial architecture for digital public infrastructure. There is also a global digital public infrastructure repository. There's a huge new focus. For the first time in the world, the G20 leaders have focused on artificial intelligence. They have focused on cyber security. Also, I would say that one of the key aspects of this presidency has been its focus on developing and emerging markets. No document of G20 has had such an immense focus on developing and emerging markets and the voice of the global south as this particular document has. This is a document of the global south. This is a document of the developing countries which came together and spelled out their priorities. And India has been the spokesperson of all the global south and spelled out their priorities in this document. This document also condemns terrorism. It denies terrorist groups safe haven and freedom of operation and many other things. But let me assure you that for the planet, there are several new initiatives on climate and health, and this has been an inclusive G20. This has been a very a G20 where the leaders give a direction to global agendas, and this has laid the foundation for very bold action. But more than anything else, it has amplified the voice of global south. It has also demonstrated that India has a huge capacity of bringing the world together and leading the world in developmental and geopolitical issues as well. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Amitabh. Following up on my colleagues, let me add a few more remarks. While noting that the G20 is not the platform to resolve geopolitical and security issues, the leaders recognized that they can have significant consequences for the global economy. In particular, they dwelt on the ongoing war in Ukraine and the impact it has had, especially on developing and least developing nations still recovering from the pandemic and economic disruption. The 3 F's, food, fuel, and fertilizers, were issues of special concern. Another subject that was addressed by them, as the Sherpa noted, was countering terrorism and money laundering. The leaders condemned terrorism in all its forms and manifestations and recognized that it constitutes one of the more serious threats to international peace and security. So, in conclusion, as you can all see, all G20 member states have come to New Delhi with a strong sense of responsibility about addressing the most pressing global challenges. Speaking for India, we are clear that no one left behind, as the finance minister highlighted. No one left behind is as much a foreign policy goal as it is a domestic one. Indeed, it should be a global one. Obviously, there are differing viewpoints and interests at play in regard to the various issues under discussion. However, we have been able to find common ground on all of them. As a result, we can justifiably state that under Prime Minister Narendra Modi's guidance, the New Delhi summit has given clear directions for the growth and development of the global economy in the years ahead. We would be glad to respond to your queries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Before I hand over, open the floor for questions, let me just mention that the document in question, the New Delhi Declaration, has been uploaded on the website about an hour ago, and please have a look at it. Let me open now the floor. I see gentlemen at the back. Yeah, right there at the back on the left. Yeah. Parikshit, right? Yeah, please. No, not there. Behind you.
One question to...
Please introduce yourself and the organization.
I'm Parikshit Luthra from CNBC TV 18. My question to Minister Jaishankar and G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant and also Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. How difficult was it to have consensus on the wording of the Ukraine-Russia war? This has been a difficult point in every conversation in the G20. There were several drafts circulated. We heard of a new draft this morning as well. Were there any countries which actually helped India in bringing consensus on the table?
I see a name. I see the lady here. Please, ma'am. Yeah, you.
Ma'am, good afternoon. My name is Ruchi Bhatia from Bloomberg News. The Ukraine paragraphs also mention about the work that Turkey did with respect to getting some sort of a consensus on the issue of the Black Sea grain deal as well. Where are things with respect to that, and can we expect any movement on that critical issue anytime soon, because it does concern several nations across the globe? Thank you.
There's a hand there, the gentleman, yeah, right at the back on the left. Microphone, please. Yeah, it's working.
This is Manas Pratim Bhuyan from Press Trust of India, PTI. In one of the paragraphs referring to the Ukraine conflict, it is mentioned that there were different views and assessment of the situation. So, how do you explain this line about having differences on the Ukraine crisis? The question to Foreign Minister or the G20 Sherpa.
Gentleman here.
Hi, this is Ashish Singh from the Geostrata. going forward, how will we see action for climate-related adaptation financing for the Global South, as especially with India being part of the Troika? Thanks.
We'll take one last question there. Yeah, there. Yeah, the lady there. I'm sorry. Behind you, right at the back.
Okay. Hi, I'm Hamna from Brute. I wanted to know, does India see itself as the leader of the Global South, and how did it assume this role? Because there's been a lot of conversation about bringing the Global South together. So, yeah.
Sir, may I?
I didn't get the last one. Last question. How does India see itself as leader of the Global South? Where is this lady? I'll just go with the stop, then I'll. Let me respond to some of the questions, and then I'd like request the Sherpa to come in on that after me. How difficult was it to forge consensus on the Ukraine issue? This, as we have pointed out, is a declaration of 83 paragraphs. It has a lot of content. There are a lot of subjects which have been covered, some of which we have spoken about. But obviously, because of the ongoing conflict, the strong views about it, considerable time was spent, especially in the last few days, in regard to geopolitical issues, which really centered around the war in Ukraine. The question who helped, eventually everybody helped, because everybody came together for the consensus. But I think if Sherpa would bear me out, I think the emerging markets took a particular lead on this, and many of us have a strong history of working together. Bear in mind that actually you have 4 developing countries in succession as G20 presidency: Indonesia, us, Brazil, and South Africa. So, but I would say, rather than who helped, the point to be recognized is that a common landing point was ultimately fashioned out. On the Black Sea grain corridor, there are many discussions going on. As you know, the Foreign Minister of Russia is here. The President of Turkey and his delegation are here. UN Secretary General is here. Other people are here. So it's natural that there would be discussions going on this. In the past, I should add, when the grain corridor was created at Bali last year, we had also in our own way contributed to some bridging of viewpoints and concerns, both between at that time between Turkey and Russia, and also worked with the UN Secretary General. On the sentence, that phrase about having different viewpoints and assessments, I think we are being transparent. It is a fact. This is today a very polarizing issue. There are multiple views on this. There are a spectrum of views on this. So I think, in all fairness, it was only right to record what was the reality in the meeting rooms, and I think that is the sense that is sought to be captured. And I will leave the climate action issue to Sherpa, and I don't know if Finance Minister would like to speak on it. But on the Global South, look, it is not, what India has tried to do, beginning with our presidency, was to seek to ensure that the concerns of the Global South constitute the core agenda of the G20 deliberations. Because after 3 years of pandemic, after economic disruptions of various kinds, after the impact of the Ukraine conflict, after climate events, the fact is that the countries of the Global South are
in deep economic distress. And that distress has not, in our view, been fully recognized till now. We therefore very consciously started off with the voice of the Global South Summit. But again, I emphasize, the voice was of the summit. It was a voice of 125 countries who participated in that summit. But we, as the G20 presidency, we saw it as our responsibility of distilling the views which were expressed in that summit and putting it before the rest of the G20. And we can take a lot of satisfaction that many of the issues that the finance minister highlighted, which the Sherpa highlighted, these are truly Global South issues, and we hope that certainly the Delhi summit and the deliberations which will take place today and tomorrow would give strong guidance to take them forward. Sherpa, Amitabhji, if you want to add to it. On the Russia-Ukraine crisis, India worked very closely with Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia. And I want to say that it was the emerging markets which played a very key role. India worked with all the emerging markets which played a very key role. There was very tough, very ruthless negotiations which went on for several days non-stop. And I really feel that in the end, the issue was clinched because of the leadership of the Prime Minister, because eventually we had to say that the leader wants it and this has to be delivered. And secondly, I really want to thank Mr. Jaishankar. I constantly took his advice and he guided me, and he gave me two really outstanding officers. One was Naidu, Nag Naidu, who's a very outstanding officer and very enthusiastic, motivated young officer who worked with me, Inam Gambhir. They did a really outstanding job as far as the geopolitical issues concerned. I had two other foreign service officers who've done brilliant work, Abhay Thakur and Ashish Sinha, on different aspects. But on geopolitics, they've done a really spectacular work. So it was really great teamwork. It was just brilliant teamwork by India, which has enabled us to achieve consensus on an issue on which the world has evaded any consensus. Even the Bali document which we talk about, actually we could not move forward with it because we could not arrive consensus in it for the first meeting. And on climate, let me tell you that this is one of the most ambitious document on climate, because it talks about almost 5.9. It moves first the language from billions to trillions, and secondly it talks about 5.9 trillion requirement for the presidency and for the G20 countries. And it lays a huge focus on life principles. It lays a huge focus on reforms of the multilateral institutions, because they were designed for the World War II and not for climate action. So all of these, it talks about new financing instruments, many other things, but in totality, if you look at it, it's probably the most vibrant, the most dynamic, and the most ambitious document on climate action that has come out anywhere. Finance Minister.
Just to add one line on the climate finance matter, the question was raised whether mitigation is being dealt with or not. It deals with the mitigation, all right, but it also looks at adaptation and resilience. I think now the debate on climate finance is also moving much more into resilience, whether it is infrastructure or planning for it or funding. Resilience takes precedence. That is one. And second, country-specific solutions are now going to be possible. It's not going to be one size fits all. The problem of each country, particularly on climate, is so different from one another. So this Delhi declaration and also the discussions which were held during India presidency has focused on that. And thirdly, pricing and non-pricing tools are also now available for countries to adopt. It is not just going to be price it if it is carbon intensive and forget the others. countries do demand pricing as one of the tools, but non-pricing solutions are also going to be a lot more friendlier to countries with different carbon emission levels. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll open there's a lady here. Yeah, please. It's okay. No, ma'am, the microphone's already there. Yeah, go ahead, ma'am. You have the microphone.
Hello. Yeah. Good evening to the panel. This is Priyashmita. I'm from Informist Media. My question is directed to ma'am. That is, now that there is a global acceptance of the fact, or at least a G20 acceptance of the fact regarding food and energy security, what is the immediate ramification on inflation and growth forecast, both domestically and globally, that you see? Thank you.
Well, globally, I think it will have also...
Ma'am, we can take questions together. Okay. Yeah, gentleman there. Yeah, you. The gentleman there who's put his hand up, if you could give the microphone to him. Yeah, thank you. No, not him, not him. I'll come to you, sir. I'll come to you in a minute. Person in front of you. Hold on there at the back. Yes, sir, you go ahead. You had the floor.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, not you, sir. Okay, since you have the microphone, go ahead. Go ahead. I don't want to waste time. Go ahead.
Hi, Stephen Borwick of Nikkei Asia. My question is for Foreign Minister Jaishankar. Is today's achievement a step towards achieving what India has described as a world of greater multi-alignment, as opposed to the more old-fashioned sense of an international rules-based order? Thank you.
Yes, sir. You had the microphone. Go ahead. Is the microphone on?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I just wanted Minister Jaishankar.
Please introduce yourself.
Dr. Wail Awad from Sana, correspondent in India. Mr. Jaishankar, Honorable Minister, when you talked of the counter-terrorism measure, how serious was the members of the G20 and fighting terrorism together? Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. You had a hand up quite some time. Yes, you right here, second row.
Samira Hussain with BBC News. I want to go back to Russia, and if you look at the language that was used in Bali, and you look at the language that was used now, gone is any reference to Russia and its aggression. Were those concessions made in order to get Russia to sign on? And do you think the weight of this has been watered down? And does that take away from its importance, especially when you're talking about fuel and food security?
Yes, you. Yeah. Right in front. No, ahead of him, please. I saw his hand. Yes, you. Please, go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, sir, Rishikesh from the Press Trust of India. Everyone must surprised by this outcome.
My question is this, that the personal bonding of PM Modi with President Biden and Russian President Putin, what was their contribution to bring this declaration? And
एक question था कि दूसरा?
Did you have one question or two questions?
One more. There was a lady, gentleman there. Yeah, sitting there. Yeah, behind you. Yeah, Pranay, go ahead.
सर प्रणय उपाध्याय हूँ जी न्यूज से मेरा सवाल इस चीज को लेकर है कि
Z News, my question is this, that the inclusion of African Union in G20, it has been done in a record time, because in June the Prime Minister wrote a letter and African Union is a part of it in the G20. How much India has invested in its lobbying? What endeavors India has made in this direction?
Maybe Finance Minister would like to...
On the inflation question, globally, of course, it's going to have an impact the moment it is executed. The understanding is executed and the grain movements start from Russia and from Ukraine. So, particularly countries which have been hard-pressed, which have originally and for a very long time depended on grains coming from these two countries, are now waiting to have that back again. As a result, I think it will cool off inflation, particularly in food grains. Domestically, we've had very little grains coming in. Except for edible oil, particularly sunflower oil, our imports have not been so much dependent on these countries. There are times when we've brought in extra edible oil, and therefore to that extent, yes, it will certainly have an impact on domestic inflation as well. But largely, India's domestic inflation is affected by vagaries of the monsoon or supply side problems. Global impact is not as much as countries which are outside dependent on grains coming completely for their consumption from outside.
If I could respond to the question whether this is a world of monthly alignment. I mean, first of all, when we are talking about G20, let us remember that this is a forum for international economic cooperation. Its primary focus is on economic growth and development. And in a way, the G20 itself is a reflection of multipolarity. The fact that there was, in a way, the salience of G7 was a decade ago replaced by the salience of the G20. I think that itself was a statement. Now, what you see before you in terms of the leaders' declaration and the discussions that are going on are obviously discussions among a very broad, very diverse range of countries at different levels of economic development, whose economic and social, cultural composition is quite different from each other. So I think in that sense it's quite reasonable to assume that there is a certain there's a spectrum of views and interests out here which we have tried to harmonize to produce the declaration. The question on counter-terrorism, what happens? I would draw your attention to paragraphs 74 and 75 of the leaders' declaration. 75 speaks about the role of the FATF because clearly the financing of terrorism is a very strong concern which the entire international community, not just the G20, shares. The 74 deals with illicit trafficking and diversion of small arms and light weapons. So I think these are concerns. So within the G20, I think these conversations are quite helpful, but obviously in terms of policy action, they will be carried into their particular mechanisms and forums which focus on the issue. With regard to the to the comparison with the Bali declaration, I would only say Bali was Bali and New Delhi is New Delhi. I mean, Bali was a year ago. The context, the situation was different. Many things have happened since then, and in fact, if you see in the geopolitical segment of the leaders' declaration, there are in totality 8 paragraphs, 7 of which actually focus on the Ukraine issue, and many of them highlight problems which are of great contemporary significance. I mean, including the efforts of the Istanbul agreements, the concerns about unimpeded deliveries of grain, foodstuff and fertilizers, the issues of attacks on the relevant infrastructure. So I think it's, one should not have a theological view of this. I think the New Delhi Declaration responds to the situation and concerns as it is today, just as the Bali Declaration did in a situation which was there a year ago. And finally, with regard to the
your question was about PM's personal bonding.
Today, in fact, not just today, yesterday, and in some cases at the Jakarta East Asia Summit as well, where the Prime Minister was there. Prime Minister did speak to a number of his counterparts with regard to what was under discussion at this summit. It is the responsibility of the Sherpa and of the ministers to put together the multiple strands and harmonize it into a document. But at the end of the day, I mean, I obviously do not want to go into very specific details, but at the end of the day, there are always, gaps and issues and viewpoints. And I think today, especially Prime Minister's talking to a number of leaders during the day, his meetings yesterday with some of them, with others, during the Jakarta meeting of the ES, I think were all very, very influential, or I would say almost determining in producing an outcome. और जो आखिरी सवाल जो आपका था,
the last question that you asked about African Union's union, the momentum was very quick. I would like to remind you that during Bali summit and at the end of the Bali summit, the president of African Union was the president of Senegal. At that time, the Prime Minister went to Indonesian President, and his complaint was about the membership of G20. The right of African Union was not discussed during the course of the meeting. The Prime Minister assured him at that point in time that under G20 presidency, it will certainly be done. And this is the guarantee of Modi. And you have seen that he has delivered this assurance that he had made. And during BRICS summit, the Magnus, the then president, came to the Prime Minister and said that you had he reminded him that you had assured us and you really impacted it.
Bali, the president of Senegal, Macky Sall. All right, that was interpreted. Thank you very much for saving me the trouble. Would you like to add something on any of them? Is there,
so we'll take a few more questions, or
I think one last.
Okay, I have a gentleman here. Yeah, go ahead. Microphone here with the gentleman in the front row.
This is Nikhil from the BBC. The question is for the Finance Minister. You said that the G20 now has its own mechanism on climate finance. So does that mean that the $100 billion promise from the West or the developed countries is pretty much dead now?
One more question. I had a hand somewhere here on the right. Yeah, that's the gentleman. Yeah, you please go ahead. Piche, right there.
At the back, please, at the back.
Gentleman there.
Hi.
No, it was the gentleman here. Yeah, you.
Yeah.
No, not there. You're behind you. Okay, if you've got the mic, just ask. We can't waste.
This is Mithil from NBC News. I wanted to ask two questions.
One question, please.
Okay, one question. The absence of President Xi Jinping at this summit, does India see this as a snub towards Prime Minister Narendra Modi, especially with the border issues, as well as President Joe Biden?
You have the microphone. You're next.
So I'm Sahil from ANI News Agency. So what kind of framework can be expected regarding crypto assets among the G20 nations?
What is it?
I saw one hand. Yes, gentleman. Yes, sir. Here. You have the microphone? Right.
What kind? Could you just have that question?
Could you ask the question again on the crypto? I think your question was?
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you repeat that? Minister, ma'am, they could not pick it up.
What kind of framework can be expected regarding the crypto assets among the G20 nations?
Crypto assets framework.
And in addition to that, ma'am, supplementary question that since we have a consensus on making common framework on crypto assets, and G20 presidency will work with FSBC and IMF
what is your
closely.
Question, please?
But the joint report of FSBC and IMF says that banning a blanket ban on crypto assets is not a solution. So my question is that is there a consensus on just to regulate it or ban it completely?
Okay. You, last question.
This is Matish Yuli from Climate Home News. You said this is the most ambitious document ever on climate, but India was pursuing an expanded language on phasing down fossil fuels, while the final declaration basically goes back to just phasing down coal. Are you disappointed with this outcome?
So I think we're running out of time, and I'll close here with that. I do think we're out of time. So I think we're running out of time, and I will hand over the floor to ma'am.
I'll start with the crypto. Well, it's really heartening that you've gone through the report. But the point is, the FSB's report and the IMF's report, FSB's concentrated more on the regulation, and IMF's looked at the macroeconomic implications. So the synthesis paper is something which the G20 membership will go through in detail. There is one more meeting under our presidency for the finance track in Marrakesh. I remember with great sense of responsibility and sorrow the earthquake which has happened very close to Marrakesh. I hope the people of Morocco are in a position to take on, and I was glad to hear the Prime Minister during this session in the morning that India stands with Morocco and we will be ready to do any assistance that the government of Morocco would desire us to do. So with that said, with a heavy heart, the next meeting was scheduled for Marrakesh, and there the FSB report and the IMF, which is the synthesis report, will be discussed, and the materials are all already available in public domain. So it is for the membership to take a call as to how it wants to move on it. A framework or a template, whatever be it. I don't think we've given it a name as yet. And also to now discuss whether it is going to be a regulation only and not a ban. I'm not getting into that debate. It is the reports, the synthesis, and also the early IMF report, both of which have been discussed. You're right in saying this report says this. It's up to the G20 membership to take a call on how it wants to move forward. And that you'll get to know more during the autumn meet of the World Bank. There was a question on climate finance. I don't think it is a question of, are you writing off this 100 billion which was promised earlier, and now that you've come up with a newer way of funding climate? I don't think it is this or that. Whatever trickle had come earlier of the 100 billion, or what it can come now through the private partnership or bringing in philanthropy or anything else, can keep going on that. But the fact remains that now the larger discussion has brought in very many more elements of how to finance. So both will have its own role to play, because climate issues attain great sense of urgency.
Would you like to speak on?
So on the fossil fuel, I'll like to say that if you read through the entire document, it's very, very ambitious. First of all, for the first time, G20 has talked about tripling of renewable energy capacity by 2030 globally. Secondly, this is the first document which talks about, which has very huge focus on fossil subsidies. And thirdly, this is the first time that there is a huge focus on billions to trillions of dollars in climate finance. There is a huge focus on Global Biofuel Alliance, which will be launched today. There's a huge focus on green hydrogen, and also there's a massive focus on energy, resource efficiency and circular economy industry coalition, and there's a focus on, to my mind, very huge focus on, the document is actually a very, very strong focus on lifestyle for environment, which is life, which the Prime Minister has initiated, and several studies have said that it can lead to 20%, and IEA study has said that it can lead to 20% reduction in greenhouse emissions. So huge focus on climate action.
So let me conclude with the last question, which is the levels of participation. I think it's for every country to decide at what level they would be represented. I don't think one should overly read meanings into it. What I think is important is what is the position which that country has taken how much that country has contributed to the deliberations and the outcomes. And I would say here that, all the G20 members, and since the question was asked specifically about China, I would say China as well, that China was very supportive of the various outcomes, and it is only because the members.
Prime Minister has arrived for the group photograph. Come. He's waiting for the other members to join. Shweta? He's waiting for the other members to join.
He is waiting for the other members to join, and perhaps this is the time where all the G20 leaders who have so far been brainstorming on what could be possible outcomes of that joint declaration, which has now been adopted, and rightfully so, in the national capital, in Delhi, under G20, India's G20 presidency. It's now time for
Let's go to the foreign minister. I think he's speaking, you know. Let's play that, right?
Senior officials, manage the finance track. Sherpa manages the Sherpa track with the support of others, but there are a number of other ministerial tracks, and I think each one of them did their meetings, produced their outcomes, and I think their contribution, in a sense, Team India contribution, if you would, I think also deserves to be recognized. But at the end of the day, the leaders' declaration, in many ways, while it is a collaborative work, very much bears the imprint of the Prime Minister. It reflects his vision in many ways. There are a lot of ideas which came from him personally. Sherpa just mentioned life as an example, and I would say, and Biofuel Alliance is another one. And yes, the green hydrogen as well. So the point is, this has been led by the Prime Minister, but it has been a collective effort by all of us within the Indian government and the Indian system, but also all our colleagues in the G20, and I would like to take this occasion to really recognize that and appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Honorable Minister Sherpa, as Finance Deputy and Climate Chief Negotiator G20. Also to all of you for coming at short notice. Thank you and good afternoon.
Yeah, I would say not a long but an exhaustive press conference, took all the issues. I think a lot of people from the Western press were there. Prime Minister got to say what he wanted to. Shri, are you there with me? Did you get to listen to this press conference?
Yes, Kartikeya, pretty much there.
Shri, okay, wonderful. Word. Please show Shri on the screen. Shri, there is a passage. Your thoughts concerning the war in Ukraine. While recalling the discussion in Bali, we reiterated our national positions and resolutions adopted the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly, and underscored that all states must act in a manner consistent with the purpose and principles of United Nations Charter in its entirety. In line with the UN Charter, all states must refrain from threat or use of force to seek territorial acquisition against the territorial integrity and sovereignty or political independence of any state. The use or threat of use of nuclear weapon is inadmissible. And there was a question also. The word Russian aggression is not there, So I think a lot of heavy lifting must have gone into this, Shri. I'll come to you, Shri.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely, Kartikeya. See, I think one of the ways in which this whole declaration agreement has been reached is by convincing Russia that the language which has been used is not any worse than what has been already used in the Bali Declaration last year. I think, but one compromise which has been made is basically in not referencing, or there's an oblique reference to, a nuclear concern. It says inadmissible, use of nuclear weapons inadmissible. But I think one factor which was not so much publicly visible last year as it is visible this year, as Delhi holds the G20 summit, is basically the proximity which is growing between Russia and North Korea. And as we know that North Korea is eyeing high-tech nuclear technology from Russia for its own intercontinental ballistic missiles. So I think by stating that use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible, I think the declaration does make an oblique reference to the direction in which the relationship between Russia and in North Korea are evolving. So I think that is something the world will want to watch. Because to my mind, that is a very significant,
Okay, let me rephrase the question. Let me rephrase the question, Sri. How did India accommodate the Chinese and the Russian concern? Let's be, foreign policy has no sense of emotion. We accommodated their concerns. That is why we have the consensus. How did we do that? Where do you think in this document the concerns are accommodated that they signed in?
No, so, Kartikeya, China's concerns are actually its own fabrication. These are not, genuine concerns. Just because you say that my old history shows that I was, in charge of this territory doesn't suddenly make you, the owner of those territories, whether it is maritime or territorial. That is something even our foreign minister said. And those are some of the disputes settled, agreed upon, even through the UN mechanism. So I think that was relatively easy, because if China keeps harping that this is our territory, doesn't suddenly make it their territory. And there are enough UN resolutions, and there is global opinion which is already settled on those issues. So I think that was fairly easy. I think the trickier one would have been to address the emerging concerns on the Russia-Ukraine war, where the alliances are now becoming far more complex, and there is a certain nuclear play which is coming into picture. So I think that perhaps was quite tricky for India to have navigated. And I think the way Delhi Declaration has achieved it is only by making a statement on the use of nuclear weapons, saying that it is inadmissible, and without directly referencing any alignment that's happening between Russia and North Korea. Because that, to my mind, is probably the biggest concern in this war, Kartikeya. China issue, frankly, was China's own making. I don't think it has a lot of global support on its own claim, even from among its allies.
Shweta, fuel,
yes,
food, and fertilizer. I think a lot of emphasis were 3 Fs. A lot of emphasis was put by Jaishankar on it.
That is true, and that is very important at a point where you're talking about a global calamity, and a man-made global calamity, by the way, of what's happening in the Ukraine. But also, let's not sideline why G20 and what the agenda of the G20 was prior to the start of it and while in the process of it, and that is to come up with multilateral institutions. Essentially, as we alluded to at the start of this discussion, Kartikeya, that is to have financing for the poorest of poor countries, more importantly, financing for African nations, which through an African bloc will now be a part of G20. 55 nations, remember, will be a part of G20 through the African bloc, which has now become a part of G20. So India has made some huge strides there in also trying to alleviate poorest of poor nations from poverty. Very interesting, Amitabh Kant pointed it, the Sherpa pointed it, a foreign minister pointed it, that this was not about one people, this was not about one family, this was about a global community, and we want to help the people who cannot help themselves. So it's not just about the interest of the biggest economies in the world, it's also about the interests of the economies that cannot take care of themselves, and strides have been made to that effect.
You wanted to ask a question to Sri?
I did, in fact, and that was largely on the consensus. And since we were discussing consensus, Sri, I want to understand from you, there's no mention, of course, of the ongoing conflict or the war, and a couple of journalists there picked that up with in the press conference with people on the podium. Is that the reason how and why we were able to reach consensus without really participating in what's going on politically, but while also talking about the suffering of the people? Because through those 3 F's, we have been able to highlight the suffering of the people, the need for food, the need for safety, the need for security, but at this and the need for, you know, not using powerful force, not using nuclear force, but at the same time not delving deeper into land conflict between countries.
Right. So, Shweta, one of the things which I've been saying is that the G20 forum is more about international economic cooperation. It is not about, bringing or settling geopolitical issues, and certainly not, you can't settle a Russia-Ukraine war, at a G20 forum. So I think the Russian-Ukraine war becomes relevant for G20 to the extent that this disrupts the global food chain, supply chain, and also impacts availability of food around the world, and especially for poorer countries which have been grappling with a huge surge in inflation. Turkey, which is negotiating the Black Sea grain deal, has itself seen a 70% increase in food prices. Now, even a middle-income country cannot cope with that sort of a hike in food inflation. So when we talk about, poorer African countries, it literally means that we're pushing millions of people, not thousands, but millions of people, not just into poverty, but starvation and death. So to that extent, the Russia-Ukraine war is very important for G20. And I think the focus will be on securing food supply and ensuring that the poor countries have access to food despite the war happening in Ukraine, Shweta.
And also a follow-up question on perhaps one of the biggest takeaway coming out from that press conference, and by the way of the final statement, and that is regulation around crypto. It looks like there is some sort of movement there. It appears that there will be a common regulation for G20 countries on the basis of what was suggested by IMF, FSB, and that paper, of course, will be up for discussion in the next meeting of finance ministers and central bank governors in Marrakesh in Morocco. We can expect some tightening, some clarity on what could be a final framework. It may not be, and finance minister said it could just be a template. There may not be anything substantial coming out of it, but this would be a recognition of cryptocurrency for the first time without outrightly dismissing it.
So, Shweta, my view on cryptocurrency is very simple. I think there is a lot of value in the blockchain technology which underlines and powers cryptocurrencies, and that is something which will be harnessed by the central bank digital currencies. So you will have sovereigns coming in, taking advantage of the frictionless payment system which blockchain allows, peer-to-peer transactions, smart contracts, which will reduce the cost of international transactions. So those bits need to be leveraged. Those are the good things about the cryptocurrency technology, the blockchain technology. But cryptocurrencies per se, I think, are crap. Sorry for the language, but I think they are trash.
Okay.
Because
but whether we like it or not, Shri, I'm sorry, I beg to differ slightly here. Whether we like it or not, they're still being used, and they're still being used, especially for terror financing, which again is a major problem that many of these countries are grappling with.
No, exactly. So you're just, agreeing with me in some sense. I'm not saying that, it's not being misused. It's being misused. It's not being used. So, I'm talking at a more conceptual level. Cryptocurrency, if anyone with a powerful computer can launch his own cryptocurrency, which is what has been happening, and there's a group of people who are basically trading it within themselves and bidding up the price and artificially inflating the price of those currencies, doesn't mean that it is something valuable. Even the very fact that there's a limited supply of Bitcoin doesn't really make it valuable. A limited supply of what? It's a limited supply of nothing, basically. So I don't think there's any inherent value per se in cryptocurrencies, in Bitcoins. So that's my fundamental issue with this. But I'm all for use of the blockchain technology, the decentralized finance technology for reducing the cost of transaction, to making transactions, especially cross-border transactions, far more smooth and lower cost for people. I mean, that's the best part about this technology. Not the currencies which are like, every day you have one currency popping up. That's, I think, utter nonsense.
I know I'm boring you.
No,
but
you're not boring me. Because you're not boring
I
me.
have one more question on the digital public infrastructure goods. The digital public infrastructure that India has very proudly showcased. The fact that you can, anywhere you go to buy a vegetable, you can go and you can scan UPI, you can make the payment, it goes to the person's bank account. The Jam Trinity, India's India Stack, and a bouquet of other UPI offerings that has come from the National Payments Corporation of India. It appears now, Shri, that there is some consensus, some definition of what could be considered a public infrastructure. What has come out of
Let me ask this. Do you get to use these digital payments in US? Is it just credit card centric, or can do you get to use your phone for these payments there?
Yes, so we do have Apple Pay, and there are a couple of other, the PayPal's been around for a long time. Yeah, so we do have, but I think the smooth fashion in which for example UPI allows, because UPI is essentially a unified payments interface. Now what I'm talking about are different wallets. So even the US, supposedly the most sophisticated financial market, does not have something like a UPI at the moment, Kartikeya, which is very interesting. And in that sense, India has leapfrogged in terms of payment technology. And that's credit to our government and our financial services industry that they have been able to come up with this. So UPI is now being looked at by other nations for integration. And how do we integrate it with, those who don't have something like UPI are talking of adopting it, and those already have their UPI kind of a system are looking at how do we now get UPI and our system to talk, so achieve the same thing, which is like easy transfer of money and easy transactions when doing business.
A lot of things are part of this document, but one which is very close to my heart, I'll read this out. It is reinvigorating multilateralism. The global order has undergone dramatic changes since World War I due to economic growth and prosperity, decolonization, demographic dividends and technological achievements, emergence of new economic powers and deeper international cooperation. UN must be responsive to the entire membership, faithful to its founding purpose and principles of Charter. And I'm saying this because in 2015, Shri, there was a late Arun Jaitley ji's residence. Prime Minister met 5 batches of journalists. I was in the 5th batch. I got my chance.
Really?
I was in the 5th batch. I also have the photograph.
To prove it.
And I was the only one who tweeted it, rest didn't. So then I had to face the music.
We trust you without the photograph.
With my own colleagues, I can say a couple of them, like now he's back in the policy work. He's a policy work. Mr. Ashok Malik was also there.
Right.
But I tweeted the photograph. And Rajavardhan Rathore ji had taken it and given it to me. But then what happened was, a lot of people were asking questions. Some were asking on Bihar, some had asked on, humko flight mein kyun nahi leke jate hain, things like that. And then Prime Minister after 10-15 minutes said, you guys are not asking me the right questions.
Really?
So we were like, oops, what happened? Did we irritate him? He said, why aren't you asking me about reforming UN?
Wonderful.
That thing has stayed with me. It was 2015, and then, once the Prime Minister left, we were, we were there for the D and the dinner. So while at the D, waiting for the dinner, Shweta, he said, you have to understand that he has already set the priorities. You have to understand by things he is repeating again and again. So in this section, which is 47, he says, the need for revitalized multilateralism adequately addresses contemporary... Okay, let us go across. Narendra Modi is speaking.
मेरे मित्र राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन के साथ इस इवेंट को को-चेयर करते हुए मुझे हार्दिक खुशी हो रही है। आज हम सब ने एक महत्वपूर्ण और ऐतिहासिक समझौता संपन्न होते हुए देखा है। आने वाले समय में यह भारत, पश्चिम एशिया और यूरोप के बीच इकोनॉमिक इंटीग्रेशन का प्रभावी माध्यम होगा। यह पूरे विश्व में कनेक्टिविटी और विकास को सस्टेनेबल दिशा प्रदान करेगा। मैं हिज एक्सेलेंसी राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन, हिज रॉयल हाइनेस क्राउन प्रिंस एंड प्राइम मिनिस्टर मोहम्मद बिन सलमान, हिज रॉयल हाइनेस राष्ट्रपति शेख मोहम्मद बिन जायद, His Excellency Rashtrapati Macron, His Excellency Chancellor Scholz, Her Excellency प्रधानमंत्री मेलोनी और Her Excellency प्रेसिडेंट von der Leyen, इन सबको इस इनिशिएटिव के लिए मैं बहुत बहुत बधाई देता हूं। फ्रेंड्स, मजबूत कनेक्टिविटी और इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर मानव सभ्यता के विकास का मूल आधार है। भारत ने अपनी विकास यात्रा में इस विषय को सर्वोच्च प्राथमिकता दी है। फिजिकल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर के साथ साथ सोशल, डिजिटल तथा फाइनेंशियल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर में अभूतपूर्व पैमाने पर निवेश हो रहा है। इससे हम एक विकसित भारत की मजबूत नींव रख रहे हैं। हमने ग्लोबल साउथ के अनेक देशों में एक विश्वसनीय पार्टनर के रूप में एनर्जी, रेलवे, वाटर, टेक्नोलॉजी पार्क्स जैसे क्षेत्रों में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर प्रोजेक्ट्स इंप्लीमेंट किए हैं। इन प्रयासों में हमने डिमांड ड्रिवन और ट्रांसपेरेंट अप्रोच पर विशेष रूप से बल दिया है। पीजीआईआई के माध्यम से हम ग्लोबल साउथ के देशों में इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर गैप को कम करने में महत्वपूर्ण योगदान दे सकते हैं। फ्रेंड्स, भारत कनेक्टिविटी को क्षेत्रीय सीमाओं में नहीं मापता। सभी क्षेत्रों के साथ कनेक्टिविटी बढ़ाना भारत की मुख्य प्राथमिकता है। हमारा मानना है कि कनेक्टिविटी विभिन्न देशों के बीच आपसी व्यापार ही नहीं, आपसी विश्वास भी बढ़ाने का स्रोत है। कनेक्टिविटी इनिशिएटिव्स को प्रमोट करते हुए कुछ मूलभूत सिद्धांतों का सुनिश्चित किया जाना महत्वपूर्ण है, जैसे अंतर्राष्ट्रीय नॉर्म्स, रूल्स तथा लॉज का पालन, सभी देशों की संप्रभुता और क्षेत्रीय अखंडता का सम्मान, डेट बर्डन की जगह फाइनेंशियल वायबिलिटी को बढ़ावा देना और पर्यावरण के सभी मापदंडों का पालन करना। आज जब हम कनेक्टिविटी का इतना बड़ा इनिशिएटिव ले रहे हैं, तब हम आने वाली पीढ़ियों के सपनों के विस्तार के बीज बो रहे हैं। मैं इस ऐतिहासिक अवसर पर सभी लीडर्स को मैं बहुत बहुत शुभकामनाएं देता हूं और सबका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद करता हूं।
Thank you, sir. India and the United States of America co-chair this initiative. And now, as the co-chair, I invite the President of the United States for his remarks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, all my colleagues. This is, someone once said in a similar domestic action that was positive, this is a big deal. This is a real big deal. And I want to thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. One Earth, one family, one future. That's the focus of this G20 summit. And in many ways, it's also the focus of this partnership that we're talking about today. Building sustainable, resilient infrastructure, making quality infrastructure investments, and creating a better future. A future that presents greater opportunity, dignity, and prosperity for everyone. Last year, we came together as one to commit to this vision. And this afternoon, I want to highlight the key ways in which the United States and our partners are working to make this a reality. Economic corridors. You're going to hear that phrase more than once, I expect, over the next decade. Economic corridors. As we work to address infrastructure gaps across low and middle income countries, we need to maximize the impact of our investments. That's why a few months ago I announced that the United States will work with our partners to invest in economic corridors. In practice, it means we're focusing on regional infrastructure projects that deliver results across multiple countries and in multiple sectors. And today I'm proud to announce that we've finalized a historic agreement for a new India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. As a key part of this corridor, we're going to invest in ships and rail that extends from India all the way to Europe, connected by the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. Bridging ports across 2 continents, unlocking endless opportunities, including making it far easier to trade, export clean energy, expand access to reliable, clean electricity, lay cables that will connect communities and secure a stable internet, contributing to a more stable, more prosperous, and integrated Middle East. And I want to thank the sponsors. And I particularly want to thank Prime Minister Modi and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, and President von der Leyen and the European Commissions. And since he's not speaking today, I wanted to, well, maybe he is speaking today. I had a note he wasn't speaking. At any rate, I'm going to stop there. In the sub-Saharan Africa, we're working in a private-public partnership as well to invest in a trans-African corridor. That includes a new partner, the European Union. President von der Leyen, thank you for making this very possible. Together, as part of this corridor, we're going to invest in a new rail line that will extend from the western port in Angola to the DRC, to Zambia, and ultimately the Indian Ocean. It's a project that's about far from just laying tracks. It's about creating jobs, increasing trade, strengthening supply chains, boosting connectivity, laying foundations that will strengthen commerce and food security for people across multiple countries. This is a game-changing regional investment, and both of these are huge, huge steps forward. But they're far from the only ones. We're continuing to make big investments in infrastructure around the world. That includes a solar energy site, an insulin manufacturing facility, and electricity project right here in India. We're continuing to develop economic corridors across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And together with our partners, we're working to mobilize the trillions of investment needed to close infrastructure gaps around the world, including the formation of a new investor forum that the United States will host in a couple weeks. Let me close with this. The world stands at an inflection point in history, a point where decisions we make today are going to affect the course of our future, all of our futures for decades to come. A point where our investments are more critical than ever. So together, let's continue to work as one to seize this moment in history and maximize our collective investments. To find new partners, to unlock new capital. Because when we invest in low and middle income countries, all countries benefit. When we invest in emerging economies, all economies benefit. And when we invest in the future of people anywhere, people everywhere benefit. So I want to thank you again for being here. I look forward to working with all of you, and I'm going to turn it back to the Prime Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. We now invite the Crown Prince and the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for his remarks.
أصحاب الفخامة والسمو والمعالي الحضور الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يسعدني اليوم نجتمع في هذا البلد الصديق لتوقيع مذكرة تفاهم بشأن مشروع ممر اقتصادي بين الهند والشرق الأوسط وأوروبا، وذلك تتويجا لما عملنا عليه سويا خلال الأشهر الماضية لبلورة الأسس التي بنيت عليه هذه المذكرة، بما يحقق مصالح مشتركة لدولنا من خلال تعزيز الترابط الاقتصادي وما ينعكس إيجابا على شركائنا في الدول الأخرى والاقتصاد العالمي بصورة عامة. سوف يسهم هذا المشروع في تطوير وتأهيل البنى التحتية التي تشمل سكك حديدية وربط الموانئ وزيادة مرور السلع والخدمات وتعزيز التبادل التجاري بين الأطراف المعنية ومد خطوط الأنابيب لتصدير واستيراد الكهرباء والهيدروجين لتعزيز أمن إمدادات الطاقة العالمي، بالإضافة إلى كابلات لنقل البيانات من خلال شبكة عابرة الحدود ذات كفاءة وموثوقية عالية. كما تدعم هذه المذكرة جهود تطوير الطاقة النظيفة وسيساهم تنفيذها في توليد فرص عمل جديدة ونوعية ومكاسب طويلة الأمد على امتداد الممرات العبور لجميع الأطراف. الحضور الكرام، لتحقيق ما اتفقنا عليه في هذه المذكرة يتطلب الاستمرار في الجهود التي بذلناها والبدء الفوري في تطوير الآليات اللازمة لتنفيذه وفق الإطار الزمني الذي تم الاتفاق عليه.
In conclusion, I'd like to commend the PGII launched by President Biden with the participation of Saudi Arabia in $20 billion. We look forward to the integration of the initiative and the Economic Corridor project, which is announced in this meeting. I would like to thank those who worked with us to reach this founding step to establish this important economic corridor. My best regard to you all.
Thank you, Your Highness. May I now invite the President of the European Commission for her remarks, please.
Your Highnesses, Excellencies, it's been 2 years since we launched PGII, a joint vision by the world's leading economies to invest in the infrastructure that low and middle income countries need. And 2 years on, more large-scale projects are seeing the light, and we are presenting 2 of them today. First, the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor. This is nothing but historic. It will be the most direct connection to date between India, the Arabian Gulf, and Europe, with a rail link that will make trade between India and Europe 40% faster, with an electricity cable and a clean hydrogen pipeline to foster clean energy trade between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, with a high-speed data cable to link some of the most innovative digital ecosystems in the world and create business opportunities all along the way. These are state-of-the-art connections for the world of tomorrow, faster, shorter, cleaner. This corridor is much more than just a railway or a cable. It is a green and digital bridge across continents and civilizations. And this is also the spirit of the second project we announced today, the Trans-African Corridor, which will connect the port of Lobito in Angola with the Katanga province in DRC and the Copper Belt in Zambia. Our goal is not only to connect a landlocked region to the sea. Our partnership will also invest in local value chains, in clean energy, and in skills for the local workforce. This is the spirit of PGII. It is a whole new approach to large infrastructure investment. It is about shared prosperity. It is about real benefits for all partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. May I now invite the President of France for his remarks, please.
Thank you so much. Everything was said, so I just want to thank Prime Minister Modi for organizing this meeting and President Biden for sharing this meeting with him. We are committed, and we had several exchanges with my friends Mohammed bin Zayed, and I want to thank you, Your Highness, and Mohammed bin Salman and Narendra Modi on this very important project. So everything was said. So now, with the European Commission here as European governments, we commit to invest alongside with you on this road, and this is a very important project from Asia through Middle East to Europe to offer big opportunities and connect people. But our intention is as well to make it real, and to be sure that after this commitment we have concrete results, and especially to have the first global green trade road, meaning having net zero transport infrastructure, so to be sure that we have the best technologies. We have hydrogen being part of this project, and we channel all the possible common developments. I think as well our intention is to have a fair process. I mean, offering a lot of opportunities to manufacture in the different countries and to cooperate very actively on building these roads, building the innovations going with it, and innovating together. I don't want to be longer. Thank you very much for this. This ceremony is very important. We commit together.
Thank you, Excellency. May I now invite the Chancellor of Germany for his remarks, please.
Thank you, and especially thank you, Narendra and Joe, for convening this event here. I think it is very important to remember that we launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment last year, and since then, PGII contributes to closing the global investment gap for quality infrastructure. As Emmanuel Macron already said, most about this initiative and all the activities we speak about today is already set, so I will not repeat it, just mentioning two questions. The first is we have to be active that these things can happen, and this is for me that we then have to also work on the infrastructure, the institutions that can work on financing, and for this I think it is also important to make the work of the World Bank successful. Germany will contribute an additional 305 million euro of hybrid capital to the World Bank, and this is one of the aspects which is a side of the activity here. We also try to work with Africa, and the compact with Africa will convene in Berlin in November, also as a sign of creating infrastructure, developing economy, all the things we are together here.
Thank you, Excellency. May I now invite the Prime Minister of Japan for his remarks, please.
はい、ありがとうございます。PGII に関するサイドイベント。
The holding of this side event on Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. On the occasion of the G7 Hiroshima Summit in May this year, as the G7 chair, Japan hosted a PGII meeting inviting private businesses for the first time, which was attended by leaders of G7 and partner countries. Japan is delivering various transport infrastructure development projects, including the construction of Delhi Metro here in the city to support economic development of partner countries. Going forward, we want to take this effort a step further to expand the scope of cooperation to wider areas, including supply chains, to link people together by strengthening connectivity. We also intend to work on building industrial value chains in the whole of Bay of Bengal. The Road Network Connectivity Improvement Plan and other northeastern regional development initiatives in India will be organically linked with the Bay of Bengal Industrial Growth Belt Initiative, or a Big B, that we are working on with Bangladesh. Furthermore, the Japan-ASEAN Comprehensive Connectivity Initiative that Japan announced at the ASEAN-related summit meeting will strengthen connectivity in a variety of areas, including transport infrastructure, digital connectivity, maritime cooperation, supply chains, electricity, as well as human and knowledge connectivity. In this way, Japan will continue to lead the effort for tangible implementation of PGII. To do that, partnership with diverse actors who subscribe to its principles is essential. For the promotion of PGII, I call on everyone gathered here once again to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. May I now invite the Prime Minister of Italy for her remarks.
Your Highnesses, Excellencies, when we launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment just over a year ago, we committed to building better infrastructure for better future in low and middle income nations. We committed to cooperate with these nations in with an equal, non-predatory approach to create new opportunities and prosperity. Today's launch of the new economic corridor between India and the Middle East and Europe goes precisely in this direction and is a milestone in strengthening global interconnections. And that is why I want to thank Prime Minister Modi, President Biden, and all the others, Ursula von der Leyen and all the others who made it possible, for it's a very important thing. This will scale up our economy's growth, opening enormous potential for mutual benefits in the business sector. Obviously, Italy is ready to play a decisive role in this process, also through the unique expertise of Italian companies in the maritime and railway sector. And we want to contribute in building bridges between the Mediterranean and the Indo-Pacific, also in the fields of energy and digital connectivity via Africa and the Arabian Gulf. In the energy sector, we keen to work in different fields, including the production and transport of green hydrogen from the Middle East to the Mediterranean. We also support the European Commission on the Helmet project, a high-voltage submarine electricity interconnection that will link Italy to Tunisia. We are working to strengthen digital connections critical for innovation and growth between the wider Mediterranean and Asia. Blue Raman, named after India's Nobel laureate in physics, Raman, will connect Europe with India and involves major companies such as Google and Team Sparkle. However, we also are aware that there's still too much to be done to narrow the infrastructure gap with low and middle income nations, and this is why we will continue work on the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment during the Italian G7 presidency next year. Thank you. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you, Your Highnesses and Your Excellencies, for launching the landmark India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. I would request all media and officials to remain seated and standing in their places while the leaders depart.
Excuse me for interrupting, but as we say in my body used to work, a point of personal privilege. I did not mention the Sheikh Mohammed of the UAE, but because I knew he wasn't speaking. But I do want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't think we'd be here without you. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Highnesses and Excellencies. I would request all media to remain seated and standing in their position while the leaders leave the room. Thank you.
Pretty power-packed thing, you know. I suppose the sort of Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, President of the United States of America. Look at these pictures. I mean, say the visual says it all. Sri, am I audible to you?
Yes, Karthikeya. I couldn't catch my name.
I said the visual says it all. Such a power-packed.
No, absolutely, Karthikeya. I don't, and you know, the president of EU, Ursula von der Leyen, when she was speaking, she used the word historic, and I'm a skeptical journalist, but I tend to agree because you know we're not just talking about a rail corridor. We are talking about an entire corridor that's going to carry green energy, hydrogen. Then we're talking about, you know, fat pipes for digital communication and even electricity going along the stretch. So this is going to transform this entire corridor. And the fact that President Biden spoke right after Prime Minister Modi, you know, to me, it is signaling to the world that this corridor is going to rival China's own ambitious border and road initiative, the Silk Route Corridor, which China has been so busily pushing around the world and trying to onboard partners for it. So in some sense, this is basically US telling China that now we are getting into the game and we are very happy to back these massive projects, which will create alternative, routes and access for energy, for electricity, for, telecommunication, which will compete or rival or be even better than China's BRI. So that's why this is very significant, Kartikeya.
Right. Shri, I want to understand, since you mentioned Joe Biden, I do want to understand US interests here. Of course, this is going to result in better connectivity between India, Middle East, Europe, and not just tech connectivity, connectivity in terms of infrastructure, on what, routes are going to be as far as exports and imports is concerned between all countries involved. And we had a lot of European countries also speaking up on how, it's going to be easier now to access these routes and easier now, and of course very important, of course, when you talk about strategic alliances. But what's US's value addition and takeaway from this partnership?
Shweta, to my mind, why US is pushing this? One, as I said, this is a counter to China's own BRI initiative. And this is US coming back in a critical market where its influence had sort of, over the last 2 years, been waning. If you look at the role that China played in bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together, I mean, that was inconceivable a few years ago. And that happened probably because of the relationship had turned a little frosty between US and Saudi Arabia in particular. So US in some sense is coming back in the Middle East area and saying that we are now going to back and we don't want to leave that area. We will play a significant role. That is number one. Number two, when we talk about a project of this scale, we are talking about billions of dollars that's going to be invested. Now, none of the leaders who spoke has actually talked about the investment, but I would imagine that this is going to run into billions of dollars. Now, this is going to create tremendous prosperity along a corridor where there is currently a lot of unrest. Poverty and terrorism all exist. There are disgruntled elements. So when you have money going into these, countries in these corridors, I think there will be a general prosperity which the citizens of these countries experience. And the bet is that prosperity would also maybe wean some away from the desperate act of joining terrorism or a terrorist group. So I think this will also have a very beneficial effect on that count, Shweta. So I think on multiple levels, this is a very significant, kind of a deal which, Europe, India, and the Middle East have struck with the backing of the US.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sri, for joining us and helping us decipher the sort of achievement, the declaration, which was least expected, mostly debated. Thank you so much for joining us, Sri. But Shweta, I think what has happened today in a very effortless manner, if we say this in context of our TV language, was surprising to many in newsrooms. It was something I would say not many people expected. To break it down for our viewers, we are also joined by Leela Ponappa, former Deputy National Security Advisor, and Ambassador Shashank, former Foreign Secretary. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us. Sir, thank you so much for making time on our show. I'm Karthike, and with me is my colleague Shweta. And let me take this opportunity to go to Madam Ponappa first. A lot of people use this language in morning, mushkil hai, tough hai. But the effortlessness with which it was announced, can you just tell us what must have gone back in the realm of the diplomats, hard diplomacy, for us to achieve this much and so much today?
The charm of diplomacy is everybody thinks it's effortless, but they should be aware that there's a tremendous amount of work that goes on behind the scenes. I'm pretty sure that there was a drafting committee that was at work at all odd hours, including through the night, and that they were finally able to come up with something that was found acceptable. It's not easy. Very often there are portions in a document, because ultimately the outcome of the conference has to be the document, the declaration, the chairman's statement, whatever you might call it. And all of that has to be found acceptable by the participants. So I think in terms of crafting this, the work would have been going on, I would say, at least for some weeks, if not months.
Okay. Sir, your opening comments on this, Ambassador Shashank, am I audible to you? Sir?
Yes, you are audible.
Yes.
Am
Sir,
I audible also?
Yeah, absolutely, sir. Your opening comments on the draft statement that has been circulated, if you had the chance to look read it, because there are areas in which the positions reiterated by the Prime Minister are very evident, and some parts were surprising, but then ultimately perhaps that led to the consensus, like the paragraph on Ukraine.
So there's no doubt about it that G20 has been re-established as a primary economic and development-oriented gathering. It was incumbent on the G7 countries, particularly, to make sure that G20 does not lose its relevance because of the Ukraine conflict, what is going on in Europe. So I think they have given up that effort, and that's number one. Secondly, I think they have also reached perhaps a stage, we do not know as yet, that diplomacy and negotiation has to be given a chance to get over this Ukraine war. So the paragraph which agreement has been reached, hard work has been done, no doubt, but I think it is the personality of our Prime Minister and the hard work done by his team, particularly Jaishankar, Amitabh Kant and Ajit Doval, in creating an atmosphere of trust and equal participation by all players. So I think it is just a question of not having anyone so opposed to India that they would go all out to somehow stymie the creation of a declaration. So I think we have been able to reach a turning point in the history of the world, if I might say so, where the Americans have agreed that this should be an important forum. We can expand it as India desired. The other countries also desired, by getting the African Union here and by making it a people-oriented forum. The final thing also, that perhaps they have reached a stage that maybe they will not be able to get a result by the war efforts which they are making, and they might come across some very, very strong hurdles in achieving their objectives. So I hope if that is the situation, then we might be in a place where G20 can lead to negotiating positions from different countries on the political issues also.
All right, Ambassador Shashank, let me first come to you quickly. You talked about hurdles that will continue to persist. Some would say the hurdles have already been crossed. In fact, some would say a consensus being reached in itself a huge success. We are talking about a stalemate for a very long time, bringing 20 biggest economies together and getting them to agree on a global war in which nobody, by the way, ever agrees on, is in itself a big achievement. What are the problems you're expecting from here on? What obstacles are we talking about?
Well, the positive things have been that, let's say, President Putin was not there. So his personal prestige was not at stake in not agreeing to anything of what was being said. Secondly, Xi Jinping was not there. So there also, one could say that, all right, India, if it is taking the leadership position, it can do that with the support of all the members present at the G20. So I think that is the achievement. The hurdles remain because the agreements have been reached about the problems faced by the world community, especially the global south, on food, fertilizer, and other supplies, on the debt problems. So I think we'll have to take a lot of steps in that direction, and it will not be an easy task. Also, Americans have recently declared that they would be supplying their Abraham tanks and depleted uranium shells to the Ukrainians. And that is being seen as a no-no area by the Russians, who have again reiterated the use of their nuclear weapon. So I think since this G20 has come up with a very clear-cut declaration by not calling anything referring to Russia, secondly, by saying that nuclear is not to be used. So I think that we are reaching a position whereby there is an opening given at the G20, and we hope that it will be taken advantage by the contending parties in Europe.
All right, let me also quickly go to Madam Ponappa. Madam, my question to you is firm and direct, and that is, we talked about how difficult this must have been diplomatically. We don't know what goes behind the curtains. We only get to see what comes out, and what comes out often gives us a lot of joys, but the hard work that you've got to put in, because you're trying to essentially, play a balancing act with, one, your Western allies, on B, your biggest importer of oil, Russia, which did not make it, albeit you have close ties with it. And India's had a very difficult role to play in the past year and a half since the Ukraine-Russian conflict began, because it's playing a balancing act. So to get everybody to agree and agree unanimously, how tough a call is it? What exactly must have happened?
Well, first of all, let me say that while we have very close partnerships with countries in the West, we are not an ally. I think India, this is something that needs to be clarified. We are partners, yes, but we are not allies, because an alliance connotes something totally different. Yes, it's a balancing act, but I think in a way it represents the position that India holds. And it has both pluses and minuses. Yes, it's a very delicate balancing act, but at the same time, I think there are certain factors that India brings to the table, both in terms of its domestic size, market, population, skills, challenges, all of which are many, and the kind of engagement that it seeks with the world. We do not judge countries, at least not overtly, although we do have candid dialogue. And I think there is a certain acceptance. For example, you talked about the purchase of oil from Russia. You had media and a few think tanks making a noise about it, saying, well, India's going against the sanctions. First of all, these are not United Nations sanctions, so that puts it in a different category. Also, I think the government of India rightly feels that there is a responsibility to our own people. And you cannot say that 1 billion plus people shall do without oil, and particularly when Europe has been importing oil on a daily basis. I think the External Affairs Minister put it very candidly. And I think this is something that these countries have come to realize, that there are certain norms that every country follows in terms of its national interest and its national security, because the import of oil is very strongly related to national security. And there is an acceptance of it. And I think these are some of the advantages that India has had, together with, I dare say, some very deft diplomacy.
I have a question, Leelaji. India, Middle East, Europe connectivity corridor, and it will connect India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, EU, France, Italy, Germany, USA. How big is it for us, ma'am?
I think any connectivity is big, and I would prefer to call it West Asia. Middle East is a colonial term. The connectivity, of course, like when I first heard about it, the question was, where in Saudi Arabia would it start? And obviously, if you look at a map, the geography indicates that it has to extend up to the Mediterranean. And this is the whole point of what India's neighborhood is. We tend to equate our neighbors with our neighborhood, whereas our economic and other interests go much wider. If this connectivity corridor to the West is something that, when it fructifies, would be a very major event, equally there are opportunities in the East that would take us all the way up to the Pacific, through Myanmar, through Thailand, through Laos, and all to Da Nang in Vietnam. But that's a separate thing that's not on the table at the moment. So coming back to your point, that if this connectivity does get in place, and I say if, because there have been attempts in the past. You might recall the attempt to have a gas pipeline from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan and Pakistan into India, because the obvious market. From the USA, Total of France were very closely involved. It came to nothing because Pakistan dug its heels in. Then there was talk of an undersea pipeline from Oman to India. That, again, a grand idea, but it did not work out. Now, if this corridor, which is a multimodal corridor, which would be rail come sea, if it were to work out, I think the extension of it would have to be automatic, because to be viable for the kind of magnitude of investment that it would require, it should reach the maximum markets available.
Absolutely. And Ambassador Shashank, I was reading through the point 47, which says reinvigorating multilateralism. And I was discussing this in 2015. We journalists were called in batches to have a dinner with the Prime Minister. And, when we were asking questions on the 5th, I was there. So lot of people asked a lot of questions, but then suddenly the Prime Minister said, you guys are not asking the correct question. So we were perplexed. It was, the dinner took place at late Arunji's residence, Arun Jaitley ji. So Ambassador, we said, what is the question? And he said, you should ask me something on reforming United Nations. You should ask me something on multilateralism, making it less opaque and more transparent. Were we able to achieve and showcase those objectives, sir?
This can't be the result of one particular summit level conference which took place in Delhi today. But I think it has been a continuous effort. Prime Minister has been working, India, Bharat has been working on it in different forums, mainly in the UN, but then through our friends in the non-aligned movement all along. Then we have been working with the various configurations. We have thought of IPSA, we have thought of RIC, we have thought of BIMSTEC, Bay of Bengal initiative, and then we have been working on various other kind of things so that the multilateralism does not become kind of a slogan only, but there should be participation by every country in a feeling that there is something at stake for them. And I think now today, for the first time, I find that that has been achieved. So what you are saying, that Prime Minister had asked you to ask the correct question, he has been able to now give you a correct answer also, that he has been able to convince all the world leaders, not only at the BRICS summit or the expansion of BRICS, but now at the G20 also, which was losing its relevance in some ways at one time when the Western countries were insisting on Ukraine conflict being where we should isolate Russia, we should get everyone to support democracy. So the same kind of slogans which were being used during Second World War were being used. So it appeared at one time that perhaps we are moving towards a new conflict situation. But I think this multilateral approach, but at the same time, practical projects which have been launched, I think that is an extremely important initiative, and I think one has to give full marks and the very outstanding role which our leader has played, Prime Minister Modi, and has been respected by all the other world leaders. So I think that this is the first time where even those who want to detract from his importance, let's say Chinese or many others, they will have to admit, grudgingly though, that he has been able to get the respect of all the other leaders, and he has been able to take practical steps so that multilateralism is accepted by others and it's not seen as something which will detract from the merit of the existing strategic organizations, military organizations, or any other unilateral, plurilateral kind of approaches.
I'm also joined by Indrani Bagchi, CEO, Ananta Aspen's Center. A very warm welcome to you. Indrani, this G20 was also organized very differently. Apart from different issues which were at forefront for the domestic media, obviously foreign media had its own take, but the word Jan Bhagidari was constantly being referred to. The editorial written by the Foreign Minister Jai Shankar, then subsequently that day the Prime Minister edit also came out, that People's Connect. Can you take us through why was this G20 summit also positioned that way on Jan Bhagidari when it's primarily an economic summit?
True. But as Foreign Minister Jaishankar actually said, that the government wanted to treat this as a national celebration. And to that extent, basically the idea I think that they started with and they worked with was a couple of things. One, that that G20 should be spread out across India to showcase India, so to speak. And therefore, you had meetings in 60 cities in all the 29 states. Second, to actually involve, this has been a Prime Minister's sort of refrain for a while, to actually involve the average person in foreign policy questions. And he has always been keen to take governance and foreign policy out of Delhi and out of the elite consensus in Delhi. He has been quite open about that, and this is one of the ways that he's done that. A third part is the government believes that Indians, which is literally the youngest country in the world, the largest cohort of young people, are actually interested in how India navigates the world and the kind of world that they are stepping into. And that's one of the reasons why G20 was spread out so far around the country. Basically, it's something that the Prime Minister again talks about quite a bit, which is sort of rooted in Indian civilization, but a global citizen, part of the world. So global issues becoming something that Indians should be interested in, be involved in, and have a view on. So I would say a lot of these things literally went to make this a sort of an all of India effort rather than a Delhi-centric effort.
Okay, let me go across to Madam Punappa. I've just opened a sort of a wire copy which New York Times has filed. I just couldn't stop myself but read it, and I want your comments to it. It's like you see the world from your own prism. It says there had been doubts that the countries participating in the summit would be able to come to an agreement that appears to have been made possible through a softening of the group's position on the Ukraine war. Is this correct, madam?
I haven't had the benefit of seeing the exact wording of the declaration, so I can't comment on it.
I can do one thing, ma'am. I can read out that, if you allow me, I can read out that point 8. May I?
Please do. Please do.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. So I'll start. Concerning the war in Ukraine, while recalling the discussion in Bali, we reiterated our national positions and resolutions adopted at the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly, and underscored that all states must act in a manner consistent with the purposes and the principles of the United Nations Charter in its entirety. In line with the UN Charter, all states must refrain from the threat or use of force to seek territorial acquisition against the territorial integrity and sovereignty or political independence of any state, full stop. The use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. Close.
Well, if you've read the Bali Declaration, a lot of this has been taken from that, because obviously that was something that all the countries agreed to. So no, I think this is just a kind of perception that would tend to validate the holding out of some countries to finalizing the declaration sooner than later. And I think this formulation has something for everyone. So they can go back to the headquarters and say, yeah, we got our point of view in. But if I may just also, taking on from what Ambassador Shashank was talking about earlier, in many ways, what the G20 today represents is its work in progress of dissatisfaction with the delivery of the United Nations. We've talked about UN reform. There's been talk about the reform of the financial institutions and so on. And that's why you have this plethora of these, whether it is for political or security or trade or economic issues at a regional, at a sort of pan-regional kind of level. Now, the Prime Minister himself has just come back from the ASEAN summit, where it was ASEAN +1, and they would have ASEAN +3 with China and Korea and Japan. It should have been ASEAN +4, but China kept us out. There was the East Asia Summit, where India has been a member right from the start. Before that, you had the BRICS Summit. So I think the world order is churning. And it's partly because of the rise of a country like China, where about a decade ago, the talk was, how do we help China rise as a responsible power? Today, the question is, how do you deal with an assertive, indeed an aggressive China? And Europe is in total turmoil. The post-World War II security architecture has gone. Russia is moving eastward as against the erstwhile movement of Germany, is moving westward as against the erstwhile movement of Germany eastward. And you have the kind of security instability in the Indo-Pacific because of China's bullying and aggressive tactics. So the G20 emerged from the crisis, financial crises, not just of 2008, but the Finance Ministers Forum was set up in 99. But the G20 has evolved. And if you take a look at their agenda, their working groups, their initiatives, and what happens with each presidency, is this a mini United Nations? We talked about multilateralism earlier. I think these are some of the questions that the non G20 members are also raising. So this is work in progress. It has reached a certain stage. We'll have to see where it goes next.
All right, very interesting. A mini United Nations, Ambassador Shashank. Would you agree with that analogy, or are we a little, far-fetched? But taking on from what Ms. Ponnappa talked about, essentially, is that world is a changing order, and for the fact that there's been a consensus, after all, in itself is a big achievement. But would you say it is like a mini UN? After all, we've needed alternatives to United Nations for a while. As Kartikeya pointed out, reforms were in order for a very long time now.
Well, I agree with Ambassador Ponnappa. And as she said that it's a mini United Nations, it is a work in progress, and we are continuously making reforms. Hopefully, the reforms will mean meaningful changes in the international institutions, whether financial, whether trade related, whether the UN itself. And I think our Sherpa also, Amitabh Kant, has talked about this becoming G20 can become even more important than the UN Security Council in some ways. And I think that is very important because many of the countries in the global south, they are more interested in the economic aspects of the international relationships where they've been kept out. So whenever there are efforts to destabilize the local situations, very often it is because of the economic hardships being faced by the local people. So I think we have to keep that in mind. But then the point is that India, which was at one time was seen out of the map of Asia, there were some leaders who used to say that no, Asia does not include India. And then later on that was opposed. Now we have reached a stage where the Chinese are trying to exclude India in some ways, and they have been given a very befitting reply from the G20 summit, where it seems that most of the world leaders have endorsed India's rising role, India's role to bring about stability, peace, negotiations, economic prosperity for each and everyone. And I think that is the direction in which we are going, and I hope that when we talk of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam or the question of one future, we are thinking more in terms of what Indian heritage has been for last 4,000 years at least, if not more. We have been teaching these values to the whole world and joining hands with them, not only as a teacher, but as a participant, as an equal participant in many of these things. So I think we have made a great achievement. It was not an easy task. We have been able to reach this position. If you look at where we were, where all our routes were being blocked, either by countries which were adversarial to us, or they were just too poor at that time and internally divided. Now the point is that most of the world leaders have given a clear-cut declaration whereby India has been accepted as a country to become one of the three most important economic powers, and which will lead to peace and prosperity for each and every person on the planet.
All right. Peace and prosperity is what we're hoping for. But a very interesting point that Prime Minister, when he spoke at the inaugural G20 session, Ms. Bagchi, he mentioned Sabka Saath, Sabka Vishwas and Sabka Vikas. So Sabka Vishwas is also now more important than ever, alluding to the fact that you need more and more consensus building, because we are in a very fragmented world. We're not just coming out of COVID, there's also an active war for the very first time hitting European frontiers, and it's still an ongoing war. So in these times, perhaps having a consensus building outlook is the new global world order. Ms. Bakshi?
Has used Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas, even in the domestic context. And it is interesting that he uses it even in the international context, because as you understand, today, trust is a very big part of international relations. And this comes from the fact that during the pandemic, we witnessed so many supply chains being closed off, so much of weaponization of resources, weaponization of technology, and basically undermining the basic trust that exists between nations. It is one reason why we have this big part of something called trusted geographies. If you look at telecom, you need trusted telecom networks. It comes from the fact that you need to trust your suppliers to not put in backdoors so that they can put in surveillance tactics on you. It's part of the trust is now a huge part of international relations, and the Prime Minister reflected that.
Okay, just let me add to it. In your opinion, Indrani, what's the biggest takeaway of the G20 for us, if I may ask you that?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we have been able to get the divide. We've been able to bridge that divide with either good language, and if you look at the wording, it actually accommodates the positions of both sides without being condemnatory on either side, except for the areas of targeting of infrastructure and the call to maintain territorial sovereignty and integrity. That's actually very important even for us. The fact that we have been able to do a diplomatic headstand, literally, and get all the countries on board a Delhi Declaration is, I think, the biggest takeaway.
Okay, Madam Ponnappa, a lot of edits were written when it became public knowledge, because first came the news from the source and then it came on the wires that Xi and Putin are not coming. Many wrote it off. So now today, not many would claim that what has happened behind, because it just came like a bite on a wire service, and then the document came, and that the press conference of Nirmala Sitharaman and Foreign Minister Jai Shankar. Can you please take us through, despite the absence of two principal players, how are we able to make it, turn it around? For our viewers, they would love to understand this.
The point is, you see, in effect, what both Putin and Xi were trying to do was to exercise a veto. And the point was that, well, you two can stay out if this is what you choose to do and you think it's in your interests. It's questionable whether it was in their interests. I would say it would have been good for them to come, but they took their decisions. But the rest of the world goes on. And in a way, this represents the very churn and turmoil that I spoke about earlier, where what started as a purely economic and financial stabilizing entity, if you go back to the early declarations, in fact, the first one at Washington in 2008, it was a brief 12-page document which had about 5 pages of the principles involved and 6.5 pages of an action plan on everything from monetary policy to accounting standards to financial stability to development aid and so on and so forth. The Bali Declaration, ladies and gentlemen, is over 1,000 pages because it has a major document of about 17 pages, and the rest of it is the annexures of all the work that took place. And this brings me back to what the G20 represents. I said mini United Nations because that's a convenient term, but it is in effect trying to be an alternate multilateral organization. If you take a look at the work that has gone in, it's not just a question of, how many meetings were held. Take a look at the Sherpa track. You take a look at the finance track. Each of them has working groups. Under the Sherpa track, we also had certain initiatives where India was, in fact, instrumental in getting the principal scientific advisors together in order to get better interaction on scientific research, or in or in the initiatives. What was very interesting in the what they call the engagement groups, the room for track 2, was to do with startups, for example. There's something for youth, there's something for culture. Frankly, the G20 agenda encompasses everything: social, economic, cultural, and now the attempt was to bring in security, to talk about the war that was going on. The option was, of course, to keep out any reference to it, but that would be ostrich-like because the war has affected the economic well-being of the world. But the formulation that has since come, I think, takes care of everybody's requirements. There's something for everyone, as I said, to go back to headquarters and say, well, we did our bit. Does it change anything on the ground? No. But as I said, the rest of the agenda goes on. And it didn't just come out of nowhere. There was a lot of work that went into it. It's very worthwhile going to the G20 website to see the extent of subjects that G20 now covers, as against the initial program when the G20 summit took place for the first time.
Okay, and before I close the show, a quick question, a common question to both of you. Indrani ji, in India, people have that popular cultural history when it comes to Soviet Union or Russia, whether it's chess, whether it's Avara, whether it's those songs, medical students. People have this sort of a nice reminiscence in context of Russia. So they understand in popular way that why we could have managed to persuade Russia not to veto it. But why didn't the Chinese do it? My question is, your take on it.
All consensus.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you read this, but there has been reporting in Chinese media that at the Chinese Communist Party leaders meeting in Bedahe in August.
Oh yes, August, I read that article. Oh yes, Nikkei Asia.
Yeah,
yes, I read that.
That's right. That's right. So, but that apart, I would say that China also wanted to normalize their position. You see, China does not function well as an outlier of the system, because China is a beneficiary of the system. And I don't think it was in China's interest. And I think somebody in Beijing woke up to it at the last minute. It is not in their interest to not be a normal part of the global order.
Madam Punappa, if I may, if you would like to take this question, what was in for China for not to veto it, despite so many things happening between us and them?
Well, perhaps I would turn that question around and say, what would China gain by vetoing it?
Okay.
Makes sense.
After all, China is not a protagonist in the Russia-Ukraine war. Yes, it is a great supporter of Russia, and it has been steadfast, and the kind of partnership that they have both proclaimed has made it very clear that China will not condemn Russia any more than it will support the addition of known terrorists to the UN's list, because they believe that it works in their interest. It's questionable. And I believe there are murmurings in China that question some of these decisions. But right now, I think they seem to think that they've made a point. The fact, as I said, is that the world goes on, China or no China. And frankly, I think they were the losers by not coming here. They could have demonstrated greater responsibility, which they have not.
Run out of time, Madam Punappa, but I do have a question. After a consensus being reached and India being hailed for that consensus, do you think it strengthens India's position in the China plus one strategy, or is it now going to be India plus plus, whoever that plus plus will be in the Southeast Asia region?
I think we have to be very realistic. about what is involved in reaching a certain stage of being considered a global power, a superpower, and so on and so forth. And this is where a domestic agenda, the kind of economic development we've had. After all, if you recall when the NAM summit was held here in the early 80s, there were 90 odd delegations and so on, but that was at a time when the Indian economy had not reached the levels that it has now. Today, I think the kind of promise that India holds for the rest of the world, in terms of its market, in terms of its capabilities, in terms of its youth dividend, and in terms of its technical abilities, is something that the world recognizes. I've heard African leaders say that when a person from there comes to India, they can be, for training, they can go back and be deployed right away. Whereas when one of their people is sent to the West, they have to be retrained in order to be able to function in Africa. And I think India is able to bridge that divide because we function at so many levels. And assuming that our economy continues to grow despite whatever challenges we face, I do believe that there will be greater recognition of what India can contribute both to the developed and to the developing countries.
And Ranji, you spoke about China. Today when Global Times came up with its editorial, who is the spoiler of the G20 summit in New Delhi, they were not only they were saying that they aren't the spoilers, but they had retweeted an interview of my colleague who works Neha, the spokesperson of the Chinese embassy, saying we are not the spoilers. And when you look at the editorial, they had put it, and they're arguing that they will not be the spoilers.
Okay, they don't want to be the
spoilers. They don't want to be the spoilers.
You don't want to be a
one of the things right? One of the things about China is that China hates being isolated. China does not like being the one person left in the room. And I remember seeing this during the negotiations for the civil nuclear deal. They were isolated at the end, and that's when they capitulated and agreed to the waiver. But China doesn't like being all alone.
Well, they can't function being alone. Ms. Bakshi, come to think
of it. I think that's a very pertinent point. Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Indrani ji. Thank you, Leela ji. Thank you, Ambassador Shashank, for joining us. Shweta, today I really, I must confess that I really didn't expect things to unravel like this.
Are you going to sleep peacefully tonight?
I think so, because I thought I really have to work through Sunday, and I really didn't expect that I'll get a flash and then a tweet and then a small bite from a wire and then the press conference, and and that's about it, and the day is over and we have the declaration. So I think there'll be more to the story. I think we've not even scratched the surface. When you cover diplomacy, when you cover foreign affairs, you get your information in pieces and layers. It's not entirely possible to get the big picture. For that, we'll have to wait. But let me take you through a couple of important bites of the Prime Minister, Foreign Minister Jaishankar, for a recap, so that the viewers who join us would understand what happened during the afternoon.
भी एक खुशखबरी मिली है हमारी टीम्स के हार्डवर्क से और आप सभी के सहयोग से नई दिल्ली G20 लीडर्स समिट डिक्लेरेशन पर सहमति बनी है। मेरा प्रस्ताव है कि इस लीडर्स डिक्लेरेशन को भी एडॉप्ट किया जाए। मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं। इस अवसर पर मैं हमारे मंत्रीगण, शेरपा और सभी अधिकारियों का हृदय से अभिनंदन करता हूं, जिन्होंने अथाक परिश्रम करके इसे सार्थक किया है और इसलिए वे सभी अभिनंदन के अधिकारी हैं। मैं अब मीडिया से मित्रों को रिक्वेस्ट कर रहा हूं कि अगर आप इजाजत दें तो हम आगे का काम करना चाहते हैं। आप सभागृह से बाहर जा सकते हैं। आज हम सब ने एक महत्वपूर्ण और ऐतिहासिक समझौता संपन्न होते हुए देखा है। आने वाले समय में यह भारत, पश्चिम एशिया और यूरोप के बीच इकोनॉमिक इंटीग्रेशन का प्रभावी माध्यम होगा। यह पूरे विश्व में कनेक्टिविटी और विकास को सस्टेनेबल दिशा प्रदान करेगा। मैं हिज एक्सेलेंसी राष्ट्रपति बाइडेन, हिज रॉयल हाइनेस क्राउन प्रिंस एंड प्राइम मिनिस्टर मोहम्मद बिन सलमान, हिज रॉयल हाइनेस राष्ट्रपति शेख मोहम्मद बिन जायद, हिज एक्सेलेंसी राष्ट्रपति मैक्रो, हिज एक्सेलेंसी चांसलर सोल्च, हर एक्सेलेंसी प्रधानमंत्री मेलोनी और हर एक्सेलेंसी प्रेसिडेंट वॉन डेर लेयन, इन सबको इस इनिशिएटिव के लिए मैं बहुत बहुत बधाई देता हूं।
The message of our presidency, as you are all aware, is that we are one earth, one family, and we share one future. This draws on an age-old belief of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The entire proceedings of the New Delhi summit are in fact organized accordingly, with 3 sessions devoted to each aspect of this theme. Now, reflecting this approach, we have consciously sought to make this G20 as inclusive and broad-based as possible. It is witnessing the participation of its 20 member states, 9 invitee nations, and 14 international organizations. It is a matter of particular satisfaction for us that the African Union has this morning become a permanent member of the G20, that too during the Indian presidency. This is in keeping with the priority that we attach to addressing the urgent concerns of the Global South. You would recall that at the beginning of our presidency, at Prime Minister Modi's initiative, 125 nations were consulted to express the voice of the Global South. In terms of its organization and program, the Indian presidency, if I may say so, has been exceptional.
With all this gear, you must be wondering if I'm climbing a mountain. Well, let me give you a wider look of this place. This is Asia's largest mountain of shame.
A mountain of waste, almost the height of the Qutub Minar.
When you enter capital cities of some of the biggest countries in the world, you don't have 3 garbage mountains waiting to welcome you, depending on whichever side of the city you enter from.
The thing is that a lot of times we talk about landfills only when there's a fire at the landfill. You need to understand that a landfill is at fire almost throughout